The American Diary of a Japanese Girl by Yone Noguchi. First chapter, collection 9. This is a librivox recording. All librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. The American Diary of a Japanese Girl. Before I Sailed. Tokyo, September 23rd. My new page of life is dawning. A trip beyond the seas, Meriken Kenbutsu. It's not an ordinary event. It is verily the first event in our family history that I could trace back for 6 centuries. My today's dream of America, dream of a butterfly sipping on golden dews, was rudely broken by the artless chirrup of 100 sparrows in my garden. Chui, 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 chui. Bad sparrows. My dream was silly but splendid. Dream is no dream without silliness, which is akin to poetry, if my dream ever comes true. 24th. The song of gay children scattered over the street had subsided. The harvest moon shone like a yellow halo of Nono-sama. All things in blessed Mitsuho-no-kuni, the smallest ant also, bathed in sweet inspiring beams of beauty. The soft song that is not to be heard but to be felt was in the air. 'Twas a crime, I judged, to squander lazily such a gracious, graceful hour within doors. I and my maid strolled to the Compita shrine. Her red stout fingers, like sweet potatoes, didn't appear so bad tonight, for the moon beautified every ugliness. Our emperor should proclaim forbidding woman to be out at any time except under the moonlight. Without beauty, woman is nothing. Face is the whole soul. I prefer death if I am not given a pair of dark velvety eyes. What a shame even women must grow old. One stupid wrinkle in my face would be enough to stun me. My pride is in my slim fingers of satin skin. I'll carefully clean my roseate fingernails before I'll land in America. Our wooden clogs sounded melodious, like a rhythmic prayer unto the sky. Japs fit themselves to play music even with footgear. Every house with a lantern at its entrance looked a shrine cherishing 1,000 idols within. I kneeled to the Compita god. I didn't exactly see how to address him, being ignorant what sort of god he was. I felt thirsty when I reached home. Before I pulled a bucket from the well, I peeped down into it. The moonbeams were beautifully stealing into the waters. My tortoiseshell comb from my head dropped into the well. The waters from far down smiled, heartily congratulating me on going to America. 25th. I thought all day long how I'll look in American dress. 26th. My shoes and 6 pairs of silk stockings arrived. How I hoped they were Nippon silk. 1 pair's value is 4 yens. Extravagance, how dear. I hardly see any bit of reason against bare feet. Well, of course, it depends on how they are shaped. A Japanese girl's feet are a sweet little piece. Their flatness and archlessness manifest their pathetic womanliness. Feet tell as much as palms. I have taken the same laborious care with my feet as with my hands. Now they have to retire into the heavy constrained shoes of America. It's not so bad, however, to slip one's feet into gorgeous silk like that. My shoes are of superior shape. They have a small high heel. I'm glad they make me much taller. A bamboo I set some 3 summers ago cast its unusually melancholy shadow on the round paper window of my room and whispered, "Sara sara sara." It sounded to me like a pallid voice of sayonara. By the way, the profuse tips of my bamboo are like the ostrich plumes of my new American hat. Sayonara never sounded before more sad, more thrilling. My goodbye to home sweet home and the camellias and white chrysanthemums is within 10 days. The steamer Belgic leaves Yokohama on the 6th of next month. My beloved uncle is chaperone during my American journey. 27th. I scissored out the pictures from the American magazines. The magazines were all tired-looking back numbers. New ones are serviceable in their own home. Forgotten old actors stray into the villages for an inglorious tour. So it is with the magazines. Only the useless numbers come to Japan, I presume. The pictures, Meriken is a country of women. That's why, I fancy, the pictures are chiefly of women, showed me how to pick up the long skirt. That one act is the whole business of looking charming on the street. I apprehend that the grace of American ladies is in the serpentine curves of the figure, in the narrow waist. Woman is the slave of beauty. I applied my new corset to my body. I pulled it so hard. It pained me. 28th. My heart was a lark. I sang, but not in a trembling voice like a lark, some slices of school song. I skipped around my garden, because it occurred to me finally that I'll appear beautiful in my new costume. I smiled happily to the sunlight whose autumnal yellow flakes, how yellow they were, fell upon my arm stretched to pluck a chrysanthemum. I admit that my arm is brown, but it's shapely. 29th. English of America. Sir, it is light, unreserved, and accessible, grew dear again. My love of it returned like the glow in a brazier that I had watched passionately, then left all the summer days, and to which I turned my apologetic face with winter's approaching steps. Oya, my book of Longfellow under the heavy coat of dust. I dusted the book with care and veneration as I did a wee image of the Lord a month ago. The same old gentle face of American poet, a poet need not always to sing, I assure you, of tragic lamentation and of far beyond, stared at me from its frontispiece. I wondered if he ever dreamed his volume would be open on the tiny brown palms of a Japan girl. A sudden fancy came to me, as if he, the spirit of his picture, flung his critical impressive eyes at my elaborate queue with coral-headed pin, or upon my face. Am I not a lovely young lady? I had thrown Longfellow, many months ago, on the top shelf where a grave spider was encamping, and given every liberty to that reticent, studious, silver-haired gentleman Mr. Moth to tramp around the Arcady. Mr. Moth ran out without giving his own honorable impression of the popular poet when I let the pages flutter. Large, fatherly poet he is, but not unique. Uniqueness, however, has become commonplace. Poet of plain plainness is he, plainness in thought and color. Even his elegance is plain enough. I must read Mr. Longfellow again as I used a year ago reclining in the spring breeze. A Psalm of Life, The Village Blacksmith, and half a dozen snatches from Evangeline or the Song of Hiawatha at the least. That is not because I am his devotee. I confess the poet of my taste isn't he, but only because he is a great idol of American ladies, as I am often told, and I may suffer the accusations of idiocy in America if I be not charming enough to quote lines from his work. 30th. Many a year I have prayed for something more decent than a marriage offer. I wonder if the generous destiny that'll convey me to the illustrious country of woman first isn't the something. I am pleased to sail for America, being a woman. Shall I have to become naturalized in America? The Jap gentleman who desires the old barbarity persists still in fancying that girls are trading wares. When he shall come to understand what is love? Fie on him. I never felt more insulted than when I was asked in marriage by one unknown to me. No Oriental man is qualified for civilization, I declare. Educate man, but, beg your pardon, not the woman. Modern girls born in the enlightened period of Meiji are endowed with quite a remarkable soul. I act as I choose. I haven't to wait for my mamma's approval to laugh when I incline to. October 1st. I stole into the looking-glass. Woman loses almost her delight in life, if without it, for the last glimpse of my hair in Japan style. Butterfly mode. I'll miss it adorning my small head while I'm away from home. I have often thought that Japanese display Oriental rhetoric, only oppressive rhetoric that palsies the spirit, in hairdressing. Its beauty isn't animation. I longed for another new attraction on my head. I felt sad, however, when I cut off all the paper cords from my hair. I dreaded that the American method of dressing the hair might change my head into an absurd little thing. My lengthy hair languished over my shoulders. I laid me down on the bamboo porch in the pensive shape of a mermaid fresh from the sea. The sportive breezes frolicked with my hair. They must be mischievous boys of the air. I thought the reason why American coiffure seemed savage and without art was mainly because it prized more of natural beauty. Naturalness is the highest of all beauties. Sayoshikaraba, let me learn the beauty of American freedom, starting with my hair. Are you sure it's not slovenliness? Woman's slovenliness is only forgiven where no gentleman is born. Second, occasional forgetfulness, I venture to say, is one of woman's charms. But I fear too many lapses in my case fill the background. I amuse myself sometimes fancying whether I shall forget my husband's name, if I ever have one. How shall I manage shall and will? My memory of it is faded. I searched for a printed slip. How to use shall and will. I pressed to explore even the pantry after it. Afterward, I recalled that the professor asserted that Americans were not precise in grammar. The affirmation of any professor isn't weighty enough, but my restlessness was cured somehow. This must be the age of Jap girls, I ejaculated. I was reading a paper on our bamboo land, penned by Mr. Somebody. The style was inferior to Irving's. I have read his gratifying sketchbook. I used to sleep holding it under my wooden pillow. Woman feels happy to stretch her hand even in dream and touch something that belongs to herself. Sketchbook was my child for many, many months. Mr. Somebody has lavished adoring words over my sisters. Arigato. Thank heavens. If he didn't declare, however, that no sensible musume will prefer a foreign raiment to her kimono. He failed to make me a completely happy nightingale. Shall I meet the Americans in our flapping gown? I imagined myself hitting off a tune of karankoron with clogs and circumspect steps along Fifth Avenue somewhere. The throng swarmed around me. They tugged my silken sleeves, which almost swept the ground, and inquired, "How much a yard?" Then they implored me to sing some Japanese ditty. I'll not play any sensational role for any price. Let me remain a homely lass, though I express no craft in American dress. Do I look shocking in a corset? In Peking, you have to speak meiki heira, is my belief. Third, my hand had seldom lifted anything weightier than a comb to adjust my hair flowing down my neck. The silver knife, large and sharp enough to fight the Russians, dropped and cracked a bit of the rim of the big plate. My hand tired. My uncle and I were seated at a round table in a celebrated American restaurant, the Western Sea House. It was my first occasion to face an orderly, heavy American table d'hôte. Its fertile taste was oily, the oppressive smell emetic. Must I make friends with it? I am afraid my small stomach is only fitted for a bowl of rice and a few cuts of raw fish. There is nothing more light, more inviting than Japanese fare. It is like a sweet summer villa with many a sliding shoji from which you smile into the breeze and sing to the stars. Lightness is my choice. When, I wondered, could I feel at home with American food? My uncle is American too. He promised to show me a heap of things in America. He is an 1884 Yale graduate. He occupies the marked seat of the chief secretary of the Nippon Mining Company. He has procured leave for 1 year. What were the questionable-looking fragments on the plate? Pieces with pockmarks. Cheese was their honorable name. My uncle scared me by saying that some charming worms resided in them. Pooh-pooh. They emitted an annoying smell. You have to empty the choicest box of tooth powder after even the slightest intercourse with them. I dare not make their acquaintance. No, not for 1,000 yens. I took a few of them in my pocket papers merely as a curiosity. Shall I hang them on the door so that the pest may not come near to our house? Even the pest devils stay away from it, you see. Fourth, the Belgic makes 1 day's delay. She will leave on the 7th. Why not 1 week? I cried. I pray that I may sleep a few nights longer in my home. I grow sadder, thinking of my departure. My mother shouldn't come to the American wharf. Her tears may easily stop my American adventure. I and my maid went to our Buddhist monastery. I offered my goodbye to the graves of my grandparents. I decked them with elegant bunches of chrysanthemums. When we turned our steps homeward, the snowy eyebrowed monk, how unearthly he appeared, begged me not to forget my family's church while I'm in America. Christians are barbarians. They eat beef at funerals, he said. His voice was like a chant. The winds brought a gush of melancholy evening prayer from the temple. The tolling of the monastery bell was tragic. Gong, gong, gong. Fifth, A chinkoro barked after me. The Japanese little doggy doesn't know better. He has to encounter many a strange thing. The tap of my shoes was a thrill to him. The rustling of my silk skirt, such a volatile sound, sounded an alarm to him. I was hurrying along the road home from Uncle's in American dress. What a new delight I felt to catch the peeping tips of my shoes from under the trailing koshigoromo. I forced my skirt to wave, coveting a more satisfactory glance. Did I look a suspicious character? I was glad. It amused me to think the dog regarded me as a foreign girl. Oh, how I wished to change me into a different style. Change is so pleasing. My imitation was clever. It succeeded. When I entered my house, my maid was dismayed and said, "Bikkurishita, you terrified me. I took you for an Ijin from American country." Ho ho, ho ho ho. I passed gracefully, like a princess making her triumphant exit in the fifth act, into my chamber, leaving behind my happiest laughter, and shut myself up. I confess that I earned the most delicious moment I have had for a long time. I cannot surrender under the accusation that Japs are only imitators, but I admit that we Nippon daughters are suited to be mimics. Am I not gifted in the adroit art? Where's Mr. Somebody who made himself useful to warn the musumes? Then I began to rehearse the scene of my first interview with a white lady at San Francisco. I opened Bartlett's English conversation book and examined to see if what I spoke was correct. I sat on the writing table. Japanese houses set no chairs. Goodness, mottainai, I sat on the great book of Confucius. The mirror opposite me showed that I was a little deer. 6th. It rained. Soft, woolen autumn rain like a gossamer. Its suggestive sound is a faraway song which is half sob, half odor. I slid open a paper door. My house sits on the hill commanding a view over half Tokyo and the Bay of Yedo. My darling city, with an eternal tea and cake, with lanterns of festival, looked up to me through the gray veil of rain. I felt as if Tokyo were bidding me farewell. Sayonara, my dear city. End of Chapter 1 of The American Diary of a Japanese Girl.
Unvisited Places of Old Europe by Robert Shackleton. First chapter, collection 9. This is a librivox recording. All librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Betty B. Unvisited Places of Old Europe. The beginning of it all. "You are the first American," said the hostess of the inn, beaming coincident hospitality, curiosity, and surprise. "You are the first American to enter this principality." And that was really the beginning of it, the incitement, the stimulus, the cause. For there comes a thrill in the very heart of the old and traveled Europe in learning that you are the very first of your own people to find out something new, something important and interesting and new. It made me realize the charm of it, and I felt that this should but be the beginning of seeking out interesting and unvisited places. And next day the feeling was conclusively confirmed, for the governor called upon me and said, with a dignity which carried his full impression of the distinction of the fact, "You are the first American to enter the limits of Liechtenstein. We know of America, and letters come from America, for to your land some few of our people have gone, but never before has any one from America entered this principality. Yet it is an autonomous, independent principality, nooked among mountains between Switzerland and Austria. It gave me a new idea of the possibilities that lie before the traveler who wishes to find the unknown or little known, yet would like to find it in connection with the usual tourist journeyings, but has neither time nor money, and perhaps not even the inclination to travel far from the usual paths. And the very fact that an unvisited place is near the beaten track gives a tang and a zest. In Liechtenstein there came a keener pleasure, a finer savor of discovery, in the knowledge that the old white castle, perched precipitously upon its cliff of white rock, is every year seen from car windows by hundreds of Americans going past Liechtenstein on the other side of the valley. There are two Europes. There is the Europe visited of Americans and the Europe unvisited, the Europe known and the Europe unknown, the Europe of the well-traveled routes and the Europe so much away from them that, so far as the mass of tourists are concerned, it might just as well be non-existent. And unless one visits the unvisited, it is impossible to have a just understanding of what Europe really is. Unless one goes where few or none among travelers have been before him, he misses the most subtle of travelers' pleasures. For the sake, therefore, of really knowing Europe, and for the sake of one's own enjoyment, satisfaction, gratification, both the unfamiliar Europe and the familiar Europe should be seen. For Europe is more than the tourist hotels, the famous cathedrals, the dimly glorious old masters, the great cities. It is all these, and very properly these, but it is also life and customs that have remained unspoiled by thronging visitors, castles that have never known the footsteps of the traveler from across the sea, regions where one finds all the fascination of discovery. And there is another and delightfully unexpected side. It is that if one learns the charm of seeking out the unvisited or little visited, it adds so vividly to his experiences that ever afterward he seeks for the unknown even in the best known places. Yield to the fascination of the long and lonely roads of the forest of Ardennes, and you will seek for the unusual in the very heart of Paris. Follow the ancient line of travel into ancient Venice, and you will look with confidence for the unexpected along Fleet Street and the Strand. But acquiring a love for half-hidden corners ought not in the least to cause one to lose his sense of proportion and belittle the places that are commonly seen. Because you come to know and appreciate the charm of Vaduz as one of the independent capitals of Europe, you should not underrate the value of such capitals as Vienna or Rome. It is the man who knows Germany best who will most appreciate Morene, the man who knows England better who will most appreciate the Scillies. The charm of seeking out the little known is infinitely enhanced by the fact that it may so easily be done. For there is a vast deal of the unvisited that is readily reachable, lying as it does in an accessible seclusion off the usual routes, but delightfully near. Yet the mistake should not be made of going to places that have remained unvisited because they are not particularly worth visiting. It is better to go to places that are of essential significance and charm. Fortunately, there are many such places, and each discovery is an incentive to the search for more. Throughout, in Liechtenstein, the first of my unvisited places of old Europe, I felt like a Columbus, for a discoverer needs not to find an uninhabited region, it need only be new to his own people. Columbus discovered America, but the native American was there before him. Livingston explored Africa, yet nonetheless there were Africans there before his explorations. And so any of us may truly discover a region so far as we ourselves are concerned, even though we find the native Europeans there. The fact that I found Liechtensteiners in Liechtenstein did not at all affect the point of view of those Liechtensteiners that I was a discoverer, nor did it affect my own. The old inn was delightful, with its floors of stone or of waxed and polished wood, and for the first day I ate in a delightful old room with walls of paneled wood that had long since mellowed to a soft nut brown. The tables were hand-hewn and bare, and the chairs were products of peasant handicraft, not without sturdy distinction of outline. The hostess was eager to please the stranger, and I was given the best of the inn's few rooms, a room low-ceilinged, immaculately clean, with an ancient smell of wood fires and beeswax, the beeswax being on the floor, and the wood fire, for it was in winter, being within a great cube of stone at the side of the room, an ancient stone stove, stoked only from the hall, the stoking being frequent and generous, with much dull and deadened noise of stirring poker and hurtled logs. There was vin de Vaduz. There was peasant bread baked by the village baker from home-grown, village-milled wheat, bread that made fragrant half the capital when the oven was drawn. There were vegetables that had been grown in the inn's own garden and stored in its great cellars. And there was the daughter of the hostess, the pretty maid of the inn, she of the black hair and lips of dewy red, and frock and apron in a harmony of brown and black, and a manner of shy curiosity as to the explorer who had ventured into Liechtenstein. It was charming to hear her prettily talk long-syllabled German, and still more charming to hear her chirp a pretty French, which she, like the other children of the principality, could freely learn at the liberal schools of the liberal ruler. In all, I felt as if living a traveler's tale of old, for all was so different from the usual impersonal service of these modern times. With the coming of the second day, I had to relinquish the delight of dining in the paneled room, and must sit in state in a stiff and formal apartment on the second floor, while the hot dishes, devotedly cooked for me alone, cooled as they were carried through cold corridors and up the stairs. A room, however, which gloried in shelves of fine old pewter. And I yielded to the change, for I saw that it was due alike to the dignity of the house and of myself. It was because of the call of the governor, beyond which there could not be greater local honor, for the prince himself lives in Vienna. When I add that the name of the governor is Karl von Indemar and Strelberg und zu Freifeld, I quote his card, that to his title of Kabinettsrat he adds that of Landesverser in Souveränen Fürstentum Liechtenstein, governor of the sovereign principality of Liechtenstein, and that he is the trusted personal representative of his absent prince, it will not seem surprising that the inn folk and townspeople stood properly in awe, not only of him, but of any to whom he unbent. I returned his call, and the day following that he came again to the inn, this time to cicerone me to the ancient Liechtenstein castle that stands in perched ruin far above. To do proper honor to Liechtenstein and to America, we were to go in the governor's carriage, the only carriage in the principality, so far as I remember, in full form, with coachmen and footmen in brilliant liveries, and it was amid the respectful awe of a group of gathered onlookers that we made our triumphal start. But the road shortly became steep, and then steeper. It had really been made for a period antedating carriages, when men rode only on horses and trained their horses to climb like goats. Unobtrusively, the footman dropped off and fell in close behind, thus becoming a footman in fact as well as in name. Up and up, higher and higher, steeper and steeper, the road mounted, and soon the horses were laboring so hard that the coachman was fain also to take the ground and coax and lead his panting pair of roans. It was evident that seldom before, if ever, had the horses been set to clamber up this mountain road. Meanwhile, with fine detachment, the Landesverser in Souveränen Fürstentum Liechtenstein spoke, charmingly conversational, of this thing and that, of world politics, of the splendid scenery, of my own journeyings, and of America. But the time came when he could no longer remain oblivious. "I am about to get out and walk," he said, "but I beg of you." But of course then I also walked, and thus through groves of noble beech trees we attained the splendid cliff and drew up in front of the castled ruin. Yes, drew up, for the horses were still with us, and liveried coachmen and liveried footmen were still with us, dignity demanding that there be no such weak giving up as would have been involved in halting 12 legs of the party on the mountainside and sending them back crestfallen to the capital. We drew up, I say, upon the noble cliff, beside the noble old ruin, and looked off at the noble view. That was the beginning of it. Once tasting the fine flavor of untrodden ways, I was determined not to be content with a single success, but to find other unknown or little known places quite as important and quite as interesting. And from time to time since then I have sought such places out, without ever departing widely from the paths followed by those who go to London, to Paris, to Venice, to Berlin. And in this book, I write of some of the places I visited, reaching them by train, by diligence, by wagon, by little boat, by sledge, a number of localities that make an easy zigzag from Land's End to the Adriatic, localities that can be visited as a series or which can be readily explored on little trips just off the customary routes. And I found a never-failing joy in thus journeying about old Europe. End of Chapter 1 of Unvisited Places of Old Europe.
Black Beauty by Anna Sewell. First Chapter, Collection 9. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Colleen McMahon. Black Beauty. Chapter 1. My Early Home. The first place that I can well remember was a large, pleasant meadow with a pond of clear water in it. Some shady trees leaned over it, and rushes and water lilies grew at the deep end. Over the hedge on one side we looked into a plowed field, and on the other we looked over a gate at our master's house, which stood by the roadside. At the top of the meadow was a grove of fir trees, and at the bottom a running brook overhung by a steep bank. While I was young I lived upon my mother's milk, as I could not eat grass. In the daytime I ran by her side, and at night I lay down close by her. When it was hot, we used to stand by the pond in the shade of the trees, and when it was cold, we had a nice warm shed near the grove. As soon as I was old enough to eat grass, my mother used to go out to work in the daytime and come back in the evening. There were 6 young colts in the meadow besides me. They were older than I was. Some were nearly as large as grown-up horses. I used to run with them and had great fun. We used to gallop all together, round and round the field, as hard as we could go. Sometimes we had rather rough play, for they would frequently bite and kick as well as gallop. One day, when there was a good deal of kicking, my mother whinnied to me to come to her, and then she said, "I wish you to pay attention to what I'm going to say to you. The colts who live here are very good colts, but they are cart-horse colts, and of course they have not learned manners. You have been well-bred and well-born. Your father has a great name in these parts, and your grandfather won the cup 2 years ago at the Newmarket races. Your grandmother had the sweetest temper of any horse I ever knew, and I think you have never seen me kick or bite. I hope you will grow up gentle and good and never learn bad ways, do your work with a good will, lift your feet up well when you trot, and never bite or kick, even in play." I have never forgotten my mother's advice. I knew she was a wise old horse, and our master thought a great deal of her. Her name was Duchess, but he often called her Pet. Our master was a good, kind man. He gave us good food, good lodging, and kind words. He spoke as kindly to us as he did to his little children. We were all fond of him, and my mother loved him very much. When she saw him at the gate, she would neigh with joy and trot up to him. He would pat and stroke her and say, "Well, old pet, how is your little darky?" I was a dull black, so he called me Darky. Then he would give me a piece of bread, which was very good, and sometimes he brought a carrot for my mother. All the horses would come to him, but I think we were his favorites. My mother always took him to the town on a market day in a light gig. There was a ploughboy, Dick, who sometimes came into our field to pluck blackberries from the hedge. When he had eaten all he wanted, he would have what he called fun with the colts, throwing stones and sticks at them to make them gallop. We did not much mind him, for we could gallop off, but sometimes a stone would hit and hurt us. One day he was at this game, and did not know that the master was in the next field, but he was there, watching what was going on. Over the hedge he jumped in a snap, and catching Dick by the arm, he gave him such a box on the ear as made him roar with the pain and surprise. As soon as we saw the master, we trotted up nearer to see what went on. "Bad boy," he said, "bad boy to chase the colts. This is not the first time nor the second, but it shall be the last. There, take your money and go home. I shall not want you on my farm again." So we never saw Dick any more. Old Daniel, the man who looked after the horses, was just as gentle as our master, so we were well off. End of Chapter 1 of Black Beauty.
Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, written by herself, by Linda Brent. First chapter, collection 9. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Jacqueline Burrell Walton. Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, written by herself. Childhood. I was born a slave, but I never knew it till 6 years of happy childhood had passed away. My father was a carpenter and considered so intelligent and skillful in his trade that when buildings out of the common line were to be erected, he was sent for from long distances to be head workman. On condition of paying his mistress $200 a year and supporting himself, he was allowed to work at his trade and manage his own affairs. His strongest wish was to purchase his children, but though he several times offered his hard earnings for that purpose, he never succeeded. In complexion, my parents were a light shade of brownish yellow and were termed mulattoes. They lived together in a comfortable home, and though we were all slaves, I was so fondly shielded that I never dreamed I was a piece of merchandise, trusted to them for safekeeping and liable to be demanded of them at any moment. I had one brother, William, who was 2 years younger than myself, a bright, affectionate child. I had also a great treasure in my maternal grandmother, who was a remarkable woman in many respects. She was the daughter of a planter in South Carolina who, at his death, left her mother and his 3 children free, with money to go to St. Augustine, where they had relatives. It was during the Revolutionary War, and they were captured on their passage, carried back, and sold to different purchasers. Such was the story my grandmother used to tell me. But I do not remember all the particulars. She was a little girl when she was captured and sold to the keeper of a large hotel. I have often heard her tell how hard she fared during childhood. But as she grew older, she evinced so much intelligence and was so faithful that her master and mistress could not help seeing it was for their interest to take care of such a valuable piece of property. She became an indispensable personage in the household, officiating in all capacities, from cook and wet nurse to seamstress. She was much praised for her cooking, and her nice crackers became so famous in the neighborhood that many people were desirous of obtaining them. In consequence of numerous requests of this kind, she asked permission of her mistress to bake crackers at night, after all the household work was done, and she obtained leave to do it, provided she would clothe herself and her children from the profits. Upon these terms, after working hard all day for her mistress, she began her midnight bakings, assisted by her 2 oldest children. The business proved profitable, and each year she laid by a little, which was saved for a fund to purchase her children. Her master died, and the property was divided among his heirs. The widow had her dower in the hotel, which she continued to keep open. My grandmother remained in her service as a slave, but her children were divided among her master's children. As she had 5, Benjamin, the youngest one, was sold in order that each heir might have an equal portion of dollars and cents. There was so little difference in our ages that he seemed more like my brother than my uncle. He was a bright, handsome lad, nearly white, for he inherited the complexion my grandmother had derived from Anglo-Saxon ancestors. Though only 10 years old, $720 were paid for him. His sale was a terrible blow to my grandmother, but she was naturally hopeful and went to work with renewed energy, trusting in time to be able to purchase some of her children. She had laid up $300, which her mistress one day begged as a loan, promising to pay her soon. The reader probably knows that no promise or writing given to a slave is legally binding, for according to Southern laws, a slave, being property, can hold no property. When my grandmother lent her hard earnings to her mistress, she trusted solely to her honor, the honor of a slaveholder to a slave. To this good grandmother, I was indebted for many comforts. My brother Willie and I often received portions of the crackers, cakes, and preserves she made to sell. And after we ceased to be children, we were indebted to her for many more important services. Such were the unusually fortunate circumstances of my early childhood. When I was 6 years old, my mother died, and then, for the first time, I learned by the talk around me that I was a slave. My mother's mistress was the daughter of my grandmother's mistress. She was the foster sister of my mother. They were both nourished at my grandmother's breast. In fact, my mother had been weaned at 3 months old, that the babe of the mistress might obtain sufficient food. They played together as children, and when they became women, my mother was a most faithful servant to her white foster sister. On her deathbed, her mistress promised that her children should never suffer for anything. And during her lifetime, she kept her word. They all spoke kindly of my dead mother, who had been a slave merely in name, but in nature was noble and womanly. I grieved for her, and my young mind was troubled with the thought who would now take care of me and my little brother. I was told that my home was now to be with her mistress, and I found it a happy one. No toilsome or disagreeable duties were imposed on me. My mistress was so kind to me that I was always glad to do her bidding, and proud to labor for her as much as my young years would permit. I would sit by her side for hours, sewing diligently, with a heart as free from care as that of any free-born white child. When she thought I was tired, she would send me out to run and jump, and away I bounded to gather berries or flowers to decorate her room. Those were happy days, too happy to last. The slave child had no thought for the morrow. But there came that blight, which too surely waits on every human being born to be a chattel. When I was nearly 12 years old, my kind mistress sickened and died. As I saw the cheek grow paler and the eye more glassy, how earnestly I prayed in my heart that she might live. I loved her, for she had been almost like a mother to me. My prayers were not answered. She died, and they buried her in the little churchyard where, day after day, my tears fell upon her grave. I was sent to spend a week with my grandmother. I was now old enough to begin to think of the future, and again I asked myself what they would do with me. I felt sure I should never find another mistress so kind as the one who was gone. She had promised my dying mother that her children should never suffer for anything. And when I remembered that and recalled her many proofs of attachment to me, I could not help having some hopes that she had left me free. My friends were almost certain it would be so. They thought she would be sure to do it on account of my mother's love and faithful service. But alas, we all know that the memory of a faithful slave does not avail much to save her children from the auction block. After a brief period of suspense, the will of my mistress was read, and we learned that she had bequeathed to me, to her sister's daughter, a child of 5 years old. So vanished our hopes. My mistress had taught me the precepts of God's word. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Whatsoever ye would that men should do unto you, do ye even so unto them. But I was her slave, and I suppose she did not recognize me as her neighbor. I would give much to blot out from my memory that one great wrong. As a child, I loved my mistress, and, looking back on the happy days I spent with her, I try to think with less bitterness of this act of injustice. While I was with her, she taught me to read and spell, and for this privilege, which so rarely falls to the lot of a slave, I bless her memory. She possessed but few slaves, and at her death, those were all distributed among her relatives. 5 of them were my grandmother's children, and had shared the same milk that nourished her mother's children. Notwithstanding my grandmother's long and faithful service to her owners, not one of her children escaped the auction block. These God-breathing machines are no more, in the sight of their masters, than the cotton they plant or the horses they tend. End of Chapter 1 of Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, written by herself. Recording by Jacqueline Burrell Walton.
Eurico, o presbitero, by Alexandre Herculano. First chapter, collection 9. This is a librivox recording. All librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Eurico, o presbítero. Os visigodos. Há tempo toda a raça goda, soltas as rédeas do governo, começou a inclinar o ânimo para a lascívia e soberba. Monge de Silos, Cronicon, capítulo 2. A raça dos visigodos, conquistadora das Espanhas, subjugara toda a península havia mais de um século. Nenhuma das tribos germânicas que, dividindo entre si as províncias do Império dos Césares, tinham tentado vestir sua bárbara nudez com os trajes despedaçados, mas esplêndidos, da civilização romana, soubera, como os godos, ajuntar esses fragmentos de púrpura e ouro para se compor a exemplo de povo civilizado. Leovigild expulsara da Espanha os derradeiros soldados dos imperadores gregos, reprimira a audácia dos francos, que em suas correrias assolavam as províncias visigóticas da além dos Pirineus. Acabara com a espécie de monarquia que os suevos tinham instituído na Galécia e expirara em Toletum. Depois de ter estabelecido leis políticas e civis e a paz e ordem públicas nos seus vastos domínios, que se estendiam de mar a mar e ainda transpondo as montanhas da Vasconia, abrangiam uma grande porção da antiga Galia Narbonense. Desde essa época, a distinção das duas raças, a conquistadora ou goda e a romana ou conquistada, quase desaparecera, e os homens do norte haviam se confundido com os do meio-dia em uma só nação, para cuja grandeza contribuíra aquela com as virtudes ásperas da Germânia, esta com as tradições da cultura e polícia romanas. As leis dos Césares, pelas quais se regiam os vencidos, misturaram-se com as singelas e rudes instituições visigóticas, e já um código único, escrito na língua latina, regulava os direitos e deveres comuns, quando o arianismo, que os godos tinham abraçado, abraçando o Evangelho, se declarou vencido pelo catolicismo, a que pertencia a raça romana. Esta conversão dos vencedores à crença dos subjugados foi o complemento da fusão social dos dois povos. A civilização, porém, que suavizou a rudeza dos bárbaros, era uma civilização velha e corrupta. Por alguns bens que produziu para aqueles homens primitivos, trouxe-lhes o pior dos males, a perversão moral. A monarquia visigótica procurou imitar o luxo do império que morrera e que ela substituíra. Toletum quis ser a imagem de Roma ou de Constantinopla. Esta causa principal, ajudada por muitas outras nascidas em grande parte da mesma origem, gerou a dissolução política por via da dissolução moral. Debalde, muitos homens de gênio, revestidos da autoridade suprema, tentaram evitar a ruína que viam no futuro. Debalde, o clero espanhol, incomparavelmente o mais alumiado da Europa, naquelas eras tenebrosas e cuja influência nos negócios públicos era maior que a de todas as outras classes juntas, procurou nas severas leis dos concílios, que eram verdadeiros parlamentos políticos, reter a nação que se despenhava. A podridão tinha chegado ao âmago da árvore e ela devia secar. O próprio clero se corrompeu por fim. O vício e a degeneração corriam soltamente, rota a última barreira. Foi então que o célebre Eurico se apossou da coroa. Os filhos do seu predecessor, Witiza, os mancebos Sisebuto e Ebas, disputaram-lhe largo tempo. Mas, segundo parece dos escassos monumentos históricos dessa escura época, cederam por fim. Não à usurpação, porque o trono gótico não era legalmente hereditário, mas à fortuna e ousadia do ambicioso soldado que os deixou viver em paz na própria corte e os revestiu de dignidades militares. Daí, se dermos crédito a antigos historiadores, lhe veio a última ruína na Batalha do Rio Crissos, ou Guadalete, em que o Império Gótico foi aniquilado. No meio, porém, da decadência dos godos, algumas almas conservavam ainda a têmpera robusta dos antigos homens da Germânia. Da civilização romana, elas não haviam aceitado senão a cultura intelectual e as sublimes teorias morais do cristianismo. As virtudes civis e, sobretudo, o amor da pátria tinham nascido para os godos logo que, fixando seu domicílio nas Espanhas, possuíram, de pais a filhos, o campo agricultado, o lar doméstico, o templo da oração e o cemitério do repouso e da saudade. Nestes corações, onde reinavam afetos ao mesmo tempo ardentes e profundos, porque neles a índole meridional se misturava com o caráter tenaz dos povos do norte, a moral evangélica revestia esses afetos de uma poesia divina, e a civilização ornava-os de uma expressão suave que lhes realçava a poesia. Mas no fim do século VII eram já bem raros aqueles em quem as tradições da cultura romana não haviam subjugado os instintos generosos da barbaria germânica, e a quem o cristianismo fazia ainda escutar o seu verbo íntimo, esquecido no meio do luxo profano do clero e da pompa insensata do culto exterior. Uma longa paz com as outras nações tinha convertido a antiga energia dos godos em alimento das dissensões intestinas. E a guerra civil, gastando essa energia, havia posto em lugar dela o hábito das traições covardes, das vinganças mesquinhas, dos enredos infames e das abjecções ambiciosas. O povo esmagado debaixo do peso dos tributos, dilacerado pelas lutas dos bandos civis, prostituído às paixões dos poderosos, esquecera completamente as virtudes guerreiras de seus avós. As leis de Wamba e as expressões de Erwig no 12º Concílio de Toledo revelam quão fundo ia nesta parte o cancro da degeneração moral das Espanhas. No meio de tantos e tão duros vexames e padecimentos, o mais custoso e aborrecido de todos eles, para os afeminados descendentes dos soldados de Teodorico de Torsmund, de Teudes e de Leovigild, era o vestir as armas em defensão daquela mesma pátria que os heróis visigodos tinham conquistado para legarem a seus filhos. E a maioria do povo preferia a infâmia, que a lei impunha aos que recusavam defender a terra natal, aos riscos gloriosos dos combates e à vida fadigosa da guerra. Tal era, em resumo, o estado político e moral da Espanha, na época em que aconteceram os sucessos que vamos narrar. End of Chapter 1 of Eurico, o presbítero.
A Flight from Siberia by Wacław Sieroszewski. Translated by Anonymous. First Chapter Collection, Volume 9. This is a librivox recording. All librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Piotr Natter. A Flight from Siberia, Chapter 1. Please yourselves. For my own part I cannot bear it any longer. It is crushing my life out, I tell you. As I pace to and fro in my hut of an evening, my brain whirls, and I feel my heart well nigh bursting. It is driving me mad. You say we shall fail. Well, we may, but what if we succeed? You say we shall perish. What of that? As it is, we are perishing. And better men than we have died, and the world has gone on just the same. If they capture us, we shall go to prison. But look around you, are we not in a prison already? Bars and walls are not wanting here. A prison? Ay, and a tomb as well. He spoke thus, controlling his agitation by a strong effort, as he walked with his two companions along a narrow path over a frozen lake covered with snow. Upon its margin the little town of Jurjuy lay all around them, plunged in darkness and sleep. It is true, he went on to say, that there is somewhat more of variety in the prospect, and our prison too has a higher roof, and he waved his hand carelessly to the sky overhead, bright with thousands of stars. They halted. One of the listeners, a man in a sheepskin coat, which was thrown over his shoulders like a Roman toga, followed the gesture and glanced upwards, whilst the other, who was muffled to the eyes in a thick shawl, stood apathetically looking out over the valley at the rising moon. "You forget, Niechorski," he said between his teeth, "that in prison there would be a jailer everlastingly watching us. You, as we all know, cannot utter 3 words but you must fly out. But when you propose to exchange this place for a dungeon, because the dungeon is better, or at least not worse, you are talking sheer nonsense, which you yourself don't believe. Yes, our life here is very wretched, but still it is a life, though perhaps only a shadow of what we would have. We are free to move about, we can see the sunshine, we are not deprived of the sight of nature, nor of womankind, nor of the society of our fellows. And there, what should we look upon? Nothing, absolutely nothing but blank walls and the hated faces of the turnkeys. And that for weeks, months, years perhaps. I confess that the very thought of this makes me shudder, and if anything could drive me to attempt an escape, it is the thought that such a prison may be awaiting me. The least want of tact on the part of anyone amongst us, the coarseness of a wretched overbearing jack in office, or even a mere accident, might easily bring me there. There," Niechorski interrupted sharply, "don't you see that this gives you one motive more?" "What did Montezuma say?" the other replied as the three resumed their walk. "Am I, think you, lying on a bed of roses? No, it is not motives that fail us, but means." "Let only the will not fail us. That will be sufficient," Niechorski returned. "Means will easily be found then. But own now that you do not care to risk the miserable crumbs still left to you, that shadow of life, as you call it, own that you are afraid." "I own that I am no madman," said his companion. "A pity that you are not one," said Niechorski with a sneer. "Nothing great has ever been done but by those whom you call madmen. Fear has always been the degrader and enslaver of men. They may have rights which they fancy cannot be abandoned, but when fear urges them they will give up, bit by bit, what they thought to be an indivisible atom of rights, yielding half of it, now and again half of that half, and so on, until their enemy ends all by saying, 'Everything must be ours. Away with you. We need decide where Carthage stands.' And then? Well, what then? Then, because they would not fight it out from the first, and stake their lives upon the issue, they go at last and blow their brains out, or drown themselves. Let me tell you, Samuel, that these small crumbs of comfort you talk of are just what makes me blush for shame. I should know, if I were in prison, that I could not help myself, that there was no getting out of the stone walls of my living grave. But here it is agony to feel that nothing is between me and freedom save a thread, the merest thread. The pleasures of this place—" "Pleasures!" cried Samuel, "why not call them delights? That is your style, and you must have mistaken the word." He stretched himself wearily, settled the folds of his plaid, and said, "It is getting late. Oh, ye Slavonic souls, who so long for the blows of the Nahaica, had we not better go to rest? Our friend Yone will turn us out upon the floor to-morrow, if we are not up in time. Where's the key, Voronin? Mislaid, no doubt." "No, it is here," Voronin answered curtly, stretching out his arm. "I mean to walk yet awhile." Samuel took the key without a word, and, leaving them, walked towards his hut, not raising his eyes until, arrived at the threshold, he looked around, and was glaring ruddily into the deep shadows. The landscape was a confused medley of soft red tints, mingling one with another. The only shapes to be seen clearly were his companions, crossing the disc of the moon as they walked away. Niechorski was waving his arms as a bird flaps its wings when preparing to fly. Voronin stood by his side, listening intently. "Oh, those visionaries!" Samuel muttered with bitterness. "Strange men they are. Have they not enough of those plans and dreams, and of that everlasting fever called hope?" After casting a long look at his hovel, completely snowed up to the very roof, he went in, and was presently standing in a warm, close room, dark as pitch. He groped his way here with as much precaution as if he were entering a stranger's dwelling, but ere he had taken many steps he struck against something that fell with a dull sound upon the dry clay floor. He swore a great oath. Did I not tell him? But there is no changing that man. Planning for ever, and leaving stools about in the middle of the room, and always forgetting the right place for the candle and matches. Finding at last what he sought, he lit a tallow candle. He did not go to bed at once, however, but unbuttoning his coat, he pulled his high sheepskin cap away from his forehead and waited for the candle to burn up, the while he freed his moustache from a mass of icicles which clung to it. He was in the prime of life, but there was already a worn look on his expressive and decidedly Jewish features. A deep furrow, like a gash, ran down on either side of his prominent nose. His auburn hair and beard were sprinkled with grey, and a quiet sadness looked out of his large dark eyes. He stood musing for some time, then, startled at a sigh which he had uttered unconsciously, smiled at himself, gave a rather scornful look at the lumber scattered in disorder about the room, and passed into his own apartment. Here, as in the other, the walls were shelving and grimy with smoke, as in the other, too, the windows were very small and thickly coated with ice. But in lieu of the rough camp bed, there was here a real bedstead adorned with a pink counterpane, and upon the interior partition, built of dry planks and plaster, between his room and Voronin's were a map, some engravings cut out of a weekly paper, and a bookshelf. Here, as he used to say in his sour fashion, he was in Europe, his companion's room was Asia. Taking off his fur coat and setting the candle upon the stand by his bed, Samuel laid himself down and opened a book. But he could not read. Niechorski's vagaries would not let him. He strained his attention in vain. There was no meaning to him in the words he saw. His heart was ill at ease, and reacted upon his mind. Fear has always been the enslaver and degrader of man. These words came once more into his thoughts, and he repeated them to himself, laying down the book and closing his eyes. His cheeks flushed a pale sickly red, he tightened his lips, and lay thus motionless for a long time. Afraid? Of what then was he afraid? Not of death, he said to himself, and tried to prove to his own mind that he saw nothing unpleasant in the thought. It was useless. He was forced to own that nothing save the dread of that awful consummation induced him to bear his lot patiently. He was, as he thought with shame, just like a chained wild beast, and that which kept him from breaking loose was the thought of bodily pain, of insults, of coarse inquisitors prying into his most secret thoughts and feelings. Even at that time the memory of certain words uttered by his captors when they arrested him, and the recollection of their whole behaviour, burned and rankled in his mind with an intensity and freshness almost beyond bearing. Once more he heard them revile him, felt them strike him down and trample on his body. And then a foul and loathsome hand came, as it were, groping shamelessly in his soul, plucking at his heartstrings, fingering at the most hidden parts of his being, fumbling among the convulsions of his brain. And the mark of those fingers was still there, an indelible scar, a defilement that nothing could wash away. Now he was no longer, and should never again be the man he had been once. He had learned to fear, to defend himself with subterfuges, to feel the pressure of vile temptations. At times he had even known that sickening torpor of spirit where bare existence is all one seeks or craves. He felt it coming over him now, that frightful vision which nothing could efface from his mind, and he started up on the bed and would have risen to shake it off, but his efforts came too late. So he sat still, his hands on his knees, his eyes staring. It was early dawn, and there was a fog. A dull glimmer, too weak to cast a shadow, lighted the yard, and showed the dim outlines of a grey old prison. The coming day would perhaps be bright and lovely. A faint rosy flush in the sky above foretold that it would be so, but down there all was murky and chilly. Nothing was plainly visible save the black arm of a gallows that stretched out high above the ground, and a square of soldiers surrounding it. Samuel's wardens had forbidden him to look out from the window of his cell, and had dragged him away by force. But no sooner had they gone than he pressed his forehead against the cold wet pane once more. What he saw was a white shroud hanging from the gibbet. Within that horrible wrapping, the body of a young man, still quick with life, tossed and jerked convulsively. He, so strong, so heroic, was dying, was dead. And now his spirit, so great, so mighty, so beloved, had gone to mingle with the universe. He had perished by the hands of men, for having loved them better than himself. And with this sight there came a terrible and humiliating sense of weakness and despair. A halter seemed to be round his own neck, cords bound his hands behind him, cutting into the flesh. And all the time the thoughts and hopes for which they had died continued to whirl round his brain, with the thundering notes of their grand hymn, with its menace to throne and altar, and its promise of a coming time free from care and pain. Suddenly the vision grew dim, swayed, and vanished, leaving him to the void in his heart, the bare Siberian hut, and the hopeless morrow. He stared round at the walls, which he saw as through a mist. Then he got up and fumbled aimlessly through the papers on his table, striving to keep down his emotions. It would not do. Try as he might, his eyes filled with tears. He blew out the candle and flung himself face downwards on his pillow. Dawn was just beginning to peep into the hut through the thick ice which coated the panes, when the entrance door creaked and let in Voronin, whose frozen boots made a clatter on the floor as he entered. Not finding either matches or candle, he came to look for them in the room of his companion, who turned in his bed. "What, not yet asleep?" said Voronin. "Not yet. Anything to tell me?" "Why, no. Do you want the candle?" "I don't just now, but bring it here again when you are undressed." Samuel had not finished the cigarette he had begun, when Voronin, candlestick in hand, stood at the door in his nightshirt, but still wearing his glasses. He set the light on the stand, but, having no mind to retire as yet, rolled a cigarette, and stood leaning against the door jamb, his head bent downwards, and his eyes looking straight at his friend. Voronin was younger than Samuel, and good looking, though untidy and ungraceful. His brown, gypsy-like face was encircled by a ring of curly hair and beard, black as coal. His usual expression was one of quiet sadness, which was in harmony with those dark hues. But just then something made his eyes shine and his lips close firmly. "So then it is flight, eh?" Samuel queried, guessing that Voronin expected to be questioned. "Decided," answered the other. "Indeed, I wish you success. And how soon, pray?" "As soon as the warm weather sets in," was the reply. "Very good, very good. Have you made up your mind whether to die of hunger, return of your own accord, or let them fetch you back?" "Return, and why?" said Voronin. "The worst that may come is better than to idle away the time here, eating our hearts out." "Oho!" said Samuel in an undertone, raising himself in bed and carefully studying his comrade's face. "Besides," Voronin went on to say as calmly as before, "there really is some chance. Beniowski and his Poles got away from Kamchatka. Every year lots of tramps escape even from Sagalien. From here it is not by any means so hard." He hesitated for an instant, and then, "Is it not a shame," he added, "that we should live here quietly while they are dying down there?" "Why, my dear good Voronin," Samuel said with a laugh, "you have caught Niechorski's disease, I see plainly. I saw him waving his arms out there, to some purpose it would seem." Here he paused abruptly, and then with a swift change from bantering to sternness, "Listen to me, Voronin," he said sitting up. "If you would do away with yourself, that can be accomplished without such needless tortures. As for any hope of a return from exile to active life, we who, no matter for what reasons, are determined never to submit and abase ourselves, must give it up as utterly lost. Utterly lost, do you hear?" Voronin made no reply but to adjust his glasses, turn his back, and leave the room, throwing as he did so his unfinished cigarette upon the ground. This meant, no doubt, that his views did not agree with those of Samuel, who presently heard him snoring, and, being quite worn out, fell asleep himself shortly afterwards. Note: Maurice Beniowski, a famous Polish adventurer, born in 1741, was nominated colonel by the Confederation of Bar. Taken captive by the Russians, and banished to Kamchatka, he escaped thence, with other exiles, and after a long series of vicissitudes, got to the island of Madagascar, when he was made a king by the natives, and ultimately slain in battle with the French. End of chapter 1 of A Flight from Siberia.
First chapter, collection 9. This is a LibriVox recording in French. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Le Foyer Canadien, recueil littéraire et historique, nouveau prospectus. Il y a maintenant 3 ans qu'un certain nombre de littérateurs, désireux d'encourager la publication d'œuvres nationales, se réunirent pour fonder le Foyer canadien. Leur but, on se le rappelle, était complètement désintéressé. Les profits pécuniaires, s'ils en réalisaient, devaient retourner à l'avantage même de la littérature et des abonnés. Ils eurent la satisfaction d'être compris du public éclairé, et l'encouragement qu'ils reçurent dépassa de beaucoup les espérances qu'ils avaient d'abord conçues. Les 6 volumes de littérature canadienne publiés depuis cette époque et répandus par tout le pays, pour la modique somme de 3 piastres, comprennent plusieurs œuvres de la plus haute importance. La compilation des opuscules, tant en prose qu'en vers, due à la plume de nos premiers écrivains, mais éparpillés dans les gazettes de 1850 à 1860, compilation faite avec soin pour servir de continuation au répertoire national, a été considérée avec raison comme un véritable service rendu à notre littérature. Le recueil, si véritablement national des chansons populaires du Canada, dont la publication doit s'achever bientôt, formera un volume du plus haut intérêt et dont la valeur s'accroîtra d'année en année. Le Foyer canadien a publié en outre plusieurs travaux importants, complètement inédits jusqu'alors, entre autres la vie de Monseigneur Plessis par l'abbé Ferland, les voyages de Monseigneur Plessis dans les provinces d'en bas, la suite de Jean Rivard, des écrits en prose de M. Larue, de l'abbé Trudel, de l'abbé Brunet, et diverses poésies de plusieurs de nos premiers poètes canadiens, et tout cela pour la somme de 3 piastres. À part ces travaux, d'autres ouvrages importants ont été publiés ou réédités par la direction du Foyer canadien, les anciens Canadiens de M. de Gaspé, les notes sur les registres de Notre-Dame de Québec de l'abbé Ferland, l'histoire de la Mère Marie de l'Incarnation de l'abbé H.R. Casgrain. Le premier de ces ouvrages a même pu être donné aux abonnés du foyer à des conditions plus favorables qu'aux autres acheteurs. Nous avons affirmé sans crainte qu'en aucun pays il eût été possible de produire plus avec d'aussi faibles ressources. Mais si le bon marché a ses avantages, il a aussi ses inconvénients. Comment, avec la modique somme d'une piastre d'abonnement, satisfaire aux exigences de tous les souscripteurs? Parmi nos abonnés, les uns, tout en reconnaissant volontiers la valeur et l'importance des écrits publiés, se plaignent que notre recueil manque de variété. Citation. Votre Foyer canadien, nous dit-il, n'est pas une publication périodique proprement dite. C'est un recueil d'ouvrages publiés par livraison, une œuvre de longue haleine, imprimée mensuellement par feuillet de 32 pages, doit nécessairement perdre de son intérêt. Fin de citation. Si pour éviter ce reproche, nous voulons réunir plusieurs livraisons en une seule, et ne sortir que tous les 3 ou 4 mois, d'autres se plaignent avec raison du trop long intervalle mis entre les diverses livraisons. Nous reconnaissons volontiers la validité de ces reproches. Toute notre ambition depuis la fondation du foyer a été de remédier le plus tôt possible à ces 2 grands défauts de notre recueil. Et nous sommes heureux de pouvoir enfin tenter aujourd'hui cette amélioration en effectuant dans notre mode de publication un changement important dont nous allons faire part à nos lecteurs. Nous considérons ce changement comme le commencement d'une phase toute nouvelle dans l'existence du Foyer canadien. À compter du mois de janvier prochain, le Foyer sera publié régulièrement à tous les mois par livraison de 96 pages au lieu de 32 comme par le passé. Le format restera le même, mais les types servant à l'impression permettront de donner beaucoup plus de matière à lire. La publication du recueil sera divisée en 3 parties distinctes. La première partie conservera le caractère du foyer tel que publié jusqu'à présent. Elle contiendra des essais d'histoire ou de la littérature par nos écrivains les plus estimés. Nous avons déjà entre les mains plusieurs manuscrits qui seront à tour de rôle livrés à la publicité. Toutefois, les nouveaux venus, du moment qu'ils déploieront quelque originalité de pensée ou de style, seront comme par le passé reçus à bras ouverts. Dans ce recueil agrandi pourront se rencontrer tous ceux qu'anime la généreuse passion du travail intellectuel. Le mouvement littéraire qui s'est produit chez la jeunesse instruite et auquel les fondateurs du foyer se flattent de n'avoir pas été tout à fait étrangers, ne peut se maintenir que par le spectacle sans cesse renouvelé des succès obtenus par ceux qui ont le courage de tenter la publicité dans les conditions nécessairement restreintes qui nous sont faites en ce pays. La deuxième partie se composera d'un choix de littérature française contemporaine, nouvelles, discours, récits, critiques, etc. Cette partie, qui recevra la plus scrupuleuse attention de la part des directeurs, ne contiendra que des œuvres remarquables par le style et par le bon goût, qui pourront sans crainte être proposées comme modèle à la jeunesse de nos collègues et à tous les amateurs de la belle et saine littérature. C'est la réalisation de l'idée que nous émettions en 1863 dans le premier prospectus du foyer. Citation. Ne pourrions-nous pas, disions-nous alors, si nos abonnés en manifestent le désir, consacrer chaque année une part de nos revenus à la reproduction ou à l'analyse de quelques-uns des chefs-d'œuvre de la littérature française contemporaine, mettant ainsi le public canadien au courant du progrès quotidien des sciences, des lettres et des arts dans le vieux monde, et offrant en même temps à nos jeunes littérateurs des modèles de style et de bon goût. Fin de citation. Ceux dont la parole a le plus de poids dans ces questions ont souvent déploré les ravages que produisent au sein même de nos familles certains produits démoralisateurs de la littérature contemporaine, lecture malsaine et dangereuse au double point de vue du style et des mœurs, Le moyen le plus naturel de prévenir ce mal funeste, c'est d'offrir à l'avidité des lecteurs des décrits à la fois honnêtes et attrayants qui ont l'avantage de nourrir l'esprit, de captiver l'imagination sans risquer de corrompre le cœur. La troisième partie se composera d'une revue mensuelle où seront relatés les événements politiques et littéraires de quelque importance de l'Ancien et du Nouveau Monde, d'une revue critique des ouvrages nouveaux et de petites nouvelles littéraires, anecdotes, bons mots, etc. Rien ne sera négligé pour donner de l'attrait à ces dernières pages et en faire la chronique amusante de la littérature contemporaine. Pour cette troisième partie, qui terminera invariablement chaque livraison, les directeurs du foyer se sont assurés le concours d'un rédacteur spécial, Monsieur Gérin, qui sera plus particulièrement chargé de la chronique mensuelle. Le nombre de pages assignées à chacune de ces trois parties dépendra des circonstances et ne saurait être précisé. Qu'il suffise de savoir que tout abonné au Foyer canadien possédera à la fin de l'année 3 volumes de littérature française ou canadienne, formant en tout 1152 pages. L'abonnement sera désormais de 2 piastres par an ou d'1 piastre par semestre, rigoureusement payable d'avance. Le transport de l'établissement de M. Desbarras dans la nouvelle capitale ayant nécessité la rescission de l'engagement passé entre lui et les directeurs du foyer, engagement auquel les directeurs se reconnaissent redevables d'une partie de la prospérité dont leur recueil a été favorisé jusqu'à ce jour. M. C. Darvaux, imprimeur-éditeur, déjà connu avantageusement à Québec par l'application d'un grand nombre d'ouvrages, est devenu l'imprimeur du foyer, à des conditions favorables pour notre recueil. M. Darvaux sera en même temps le gérant du foyer. Il percevra les abonnements, tiendra la liste des abonnés, correspondra avec les agents locaux, sera chargé de la distribution des livraisons et fera, en un mot, tout ce qui dépendra de lui pour la bonne administration des affaires du foyer. Ce prospectus n'est adressé qu'à un petit nombre de personnes. Celles qui le recevront sont priées d'en donner connaissance à leurs amis. Notre intention n'est pas de faire de la réclame en faveur d'une entreprise à laquelle aucun de nous n'est intéressé pécuniairement. Nous ne voulons pas non plus fatiguer le public par des demandes d'encouragement. Nous nous contentons, comme par le passé, d'exposer notre but et les moyens que nous croyons les plus propres à nous assurer le succès. C'est aux amis des lettres et à tous ceux qui ont à cœur la diffusion des connaissances et des saines idées de seconder nos humbles efforts, chacun dans sa sphère et sa localité respective. L'avenir nous dira si nous nous sommes trompés en comptant sur le patriotisme et sur le goût naturel de notre population pour les récits qui retracent les événements de son histoire, les phases diverses de sa vie sociale, ou qui rappellent le souvenir de son ancienne mère patrie. La direction du Foyer canadien. Post-scriptum. Toute communication relative au foyer devra être adressée à M. C. Darvaux, gérant du Foyer canadien, rue de la Montagne, Québec. M. Darvaux percevra aussi les abonnements. On peut s'abonner en outre à Québec chez M. Garand et Trudel et E. Matt Hauteville, à Montréal chez M. Favre et Gravel et Roland et Fils. Québec, janvier 1866. Fin du préambule. Au Foyer canadien, recueil littéraire et historique de 1866. Lu en français par Sandra à Rigaud, Québec, 2021.
Along French Byways by Clifton Johnson. First chapter, collection 9. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Betty B. Along French Byways. First Impressions. After a long day's railroad journey from Holland, I arrived at Calais late one night in the latter part of May, and looked about the big, dim-lit station, questioning within myself how I should find a lodging place. A clock whose pointers indicated that it was past midnight was the only intelligible thing in sight, for all the signs and posters were in French, and only French words greeted my ears. As I knew almost nothing of the language, and still less of its proper pronunciation, it could about as well have been Chinese. While I was hesitating in doubt as to what to do next, a group of clamorous coachmen assailed me, each man intent on rushing me off to his particular hotel. My response in English only served to increase their ardor without contributing a single iota to the information I desired. In the end, I would have been compelled to trust my fate to one of them and take the chances of getting accommodations to my liking, had not a railroad porter come up who said he could talk English. From him I learned that a large hotel was run in connection with the station. I knew from experience in England that railroad hotels were generally excellent, and I was rejoiced that there was no need to go farther that night. I extricated myself from amid the disappointed coachmen, who must now return to their various hostelries empty-handed, and follow the guidance of my new friend. He did not leave me till he had seen me to a room in the hotel. On the following day I met this English-speaking porter again. He was off duty at the time, and when he offered to show me about the town, I gladly accepted his companionship. We lingered longest in the older parts. Their gray antiquity was very delightful, and I was especially interested in a tall, weather-worn lighthouse that rises above all the other town buildings on the borders of the marketplace. It has outlived its usefulness as a lighthouse and now serves as a watchtower. Each night from 11 o'clock on, a lone sentinel looks out on the town from the glass windows at the summit of the old lighthouse. Every quarter of an hour he blows a blast on a horn to let the citizens know that all is well, while the end of each hour is marked by 4 blasts, one blown toward each quarter of the compass. If the watchman sees a fire or anything else wrong, he sounds the alarm by ringing a bell. The porter and I became quite comfortably friendly on our walk, and I found him intelligent and entertaining. In his broken English he spoke of his fellow countrymen with great frankness, and his comments on national characteristics were suggestive and enlightening. For one thing, he said that the relations of the men and women were marked by mutual distrust, and the men in particular are convinced that all women are deceitful and unstable. The porter agreed with the justice of this general verdict on the character of the French women, but palliated their faultiness by observing that it might be the result of the men's leading on. Still, he did not think the men would lead on if they were not encouraged to do so by the women themselves. A Frenchman likes sentiment, he explained, but responsibility sits lightly on him, and he forgets the most ardent professions and skips from one love to another as fancy dictates. If the porter was right in his elucidations, the tender passion as experienced in France is a sort of frenzy in which the judicial faculties play small part. When a person is in love, said he, you do not think. People are not made of wood. You do what the one you love asks. I do what the girl asks. She does what I ask. I have the proof in my own life. There was a girl I loved, but my folks did not approve her. One afternoon I call and she was sick. I sat in her bedroom and we talk and she says she is discouraged. She tell me she is discouraged 3-4 times and I say in a joke, well, why don't you go kill yourself? Then I look away out the window for a little and I hear a gurgle. I look back quick to the bed and the girl have a string around her neck and pulling and black in the countenance. I jump and take the string away and say, what for you make a fool of yourself when I remark a pleasant saying for the fun? She reply, you say to do so. But it was her impulse for the day only. If she had kill, tomorrow she would be sorry for it. That is the way of us. We do desperate attempts by impulse only and when excited. For the moment we have great heat and much daring. After that we are all gone. No courage, no nothing. You Americans, you different. You no have to get drunk to be revenge. You can wait. You shoot a man in cold blood. Ah, I like that way much the better. I was not inclined to accept unreservedly either the porter's rather dubious praise of Americans, or his strictures on his own people. It is doubtless true that the French lack the staying qualities of the English race and act more on impulse, yet I saw a good deal of French life in my varied touring that seemed to me as simple and domestic and as honestly affectionate as could be found anywhere. The people are unfailingly polite, the peasantry no less than the upper classes. Even the accent, yes, and the look of their printed words have an air of suavity that attracts and pleases. In the country districts, the people bow when they meet you and say "Bonjour, monsieur." It is a greeting that is given as a matter of course, and you receive it just as surely from the little children and the women as you do from the men, who add a touch of the hat. It makes a very agreeable impression on the sojourner from abroad to be accorded such courtesy and friendliness. Among themselves the exchange of pleasant salutations at meeting and parting is universal. This is true of all classes, from the laborers up, and besides every man is given his prefix. That they should monsieur, the curé, and doctor, and the stranger is to be expected, but they also, with the same respectfulness, address the butcher, the baker, and the ditch digger. It was delightful, yet whether this politeness was more than surface deep may be a question. I sometimes had my doubts of it when I noted how little hesitation the people showed in loading me with their bad money. Belgian, Swiss, Turkish, and other coins are in common circulation in France. They are much like French money in size and appearance, and some of them are good and some are not. Often when I was buying a railroad ticket, I would see the agent poke over his drawer in what I believed was a search for bad money, depreciated foreign coins which native travelers were of course wise enough to refuse, and the more he could inveigle into my change, the better he was pleased. I always felt helpless and at his mercy, for I was usually in a hurry, and I was never quite sure enough about the coins to make my protest prompt and effective. I gradually gathered a pocketful of this poor currency and knew not what to do with it till I returned to London, where I sold it for what it would bring at a money exchange. I usually traveled on the railroads third class. This was partly for economy, partly because my fellow passengers in that class were sure to disclose their impulses with much greater freedom than the wealthier folks who journeyed in the more aristocratic apartments. In England, the third-class carriages are, as a rule, fairly comfortable, but on the continent they are so rude that it is something of a hardship to ride in them. They are not much better than one of our freight cars would be, with some cushionless benches run across the interior. The occupants indulge freely in smoking, spitting, and loud talking, and the only alleviation within reach is to sit near the front of the coach and keep a window open. French nature, as seen traveling third class, is characterized by a very grasshoppery liveliness. The people are extremely sociable. They chat together vociferously, and their talk is nearly always full of joking and laughter. Sometimes their animation runs into boisterousness, and they sing, shout, and gesture. It has been said, give a Frenchman a pair of dumbbells and ask him about the weather, and before his answer is finished, he will have taken enough healthful exercise to last him all day. The statement may have in it a grain of exaggeration, but it is not very far from fact after all. When 3 or 4 persons come to a station to see friends off, there is almost a riot of affectionate parting. It is not confined to lively repartee, for everyone has to be kissed, and French custom allows 2 kisses to a person, 1 on each cheek. Kissing and embracing are indulged in on all sorts of occasions with much more publicity than I have ever seen elsewhere. Indeed, I thought privacy of any sort seemed to be foreign to the genius of the people. The loquacity of my railroad companions was by no means confined to mere sociability and the exchange of pleasantries. There were serious discussions as well, and men who did not look at all wise would distill wisdom by the hour with a voluble violence that made my head spin. Let 2 disputants sit opposite each other, and as their excitement increased, they would get their noses together, slap hands, and wave their arms about until they seemed on the point of settling the question at issue with fists and muscle. I confess I was sometimes scared and was concerned lest they should pitch each other out the windows. I never saw any one convince his antagonist. The sarcastic shakes of the head and the long-drawn scornful ahs punctuated the wordy duel, and in the end both seemed grimly contemptuous of the other's pig-headedness. Politics was, I believe, more frequently the subject of these contentions. Questions of government policy are discussed in France with peculiar bitterness, and as a result families are often divided, and one-time friends become enemies. Every man takes sides and is a staunch partisan, seeing no sense in any view other than his own. And when an affair has been voted on and for the time being at least settled, he still continues as pugnacious on that topic as if it was to be voted on again the day following. In my railway journeys I found everyone I met friendly, and I never made a request or asked a question that did not call forth the most earnest effort to understand me and put me right. Once in a while someone would try to carry on a general conversation with me, but as our chief dependents had to be sign language, the results were rather discouraging. There was one occasion when a young Frenchman spent half a day in the attempt to tell me about himself and learn who and what I was. I suppose time hung heavy on his hands, for we were on a narrow gauge railroad, and our train was so leisurely we might about as well have gone on foot. Our talk apparently had the most absorbing interest for my companion, and this interest was shared by the other occupants of the car, who gathered around us and looked on with fascinated attention. My new acquaintance had in some way picked up a few words of English, and I had at command about as many words of French, but as he gave his English words a French pronunciation, and I gave my French words an English pronunciation, this knowledge was well nigh useless. It took us so long in our conversation to make connections that my friend finally got out a pencil and a piece of paper, and we tried writing. Our progress by this method was a trifle smoother. Still, it was nothing to boast of, and I wondered at the pleasure my companion seemed to find in our halting interchange of thought. He would write, and then, to see if I understood, would look up at me as raptly as if I had been his sweetheart. Toward the end of our journey he wanted to know if I would correspond with him. Judging from the experience we had already had, I thought it would prove too vast a task, and I tried to tell him no, but could not manage the language to refuse gently, and was forced to acquiesce and give him my address. I was often in trouble through my lack of French in the earlier days of my touring. One odd complication occurred at Rouen. There were 2 stations in the town. Only of this I was unaware, and my baggage was at one, but it was from the other I must take my departure. At the station where I arrived, I had fallen into the hands of a blue-smocked porter, who explained the situation and what I was to do over and over again, but I failed to catch the idea of the 2 stations. The porter trotted me around and held excited conversations with various railroad employees, and they all jabbered advice at me. I concluded the gist of their remarks was that I must wait a couple of hours, and tried to indicate that meanwhile I would take a walk about town. I paid Bluesmock, but he was not satisfied and insisted on sticking to me. He talked and motioned, and I could see he had some scheme or other in mind for my benefit, but I did not gather the least notion of what it was. We left the station, and I went in his company along the street until we came to a park where I insisted on turning aside. I sat down on one of the benches. It was a pleasant spot. There were trees and flower beds, plots of grass, and a rocky little lake with 2 stately swans adrift on its quiet surface. Several children were playing at the waterside with floating swan feathers. Other children were running about the paths, and many grown-up folk were sitting on the chairs and benches. I would have been very comfortable there in the shade of the horse-chestnut trees if the porter had left me alone. But he stood before me motioning and exclaiming, and the children gathered around, all agape, looking on. This notoriety was too much for me, and I succumbed and followed after Bluesmock. We had just returned to the busy city sidewalk, and my self-constituted guardian was pushing on eagerly ahead, when I noticed a sign in the window of a hotel, English spoken. I stopped and looked after Bluesmock, hastening along in full faith that I was at his heels, but I did not know what to do with him, and I simply let him travel on. I would like to know what he thought became of me, and I have no doubt the story from his point of view would be interesting. At the hotel I got the lacking information about the across-town station, and my peace of mind was restored, save for some slight compunctions of conscience with regard to my abandonment of Blue Smock. The views that I had from the car window in my journeyings in the Northwest were very attractive. Along the coast there were sand dunes, looming constantly against the western sky, yet with gaps now and then affording a glimpse of the hazy sea, with perhaps a fleet of fishing boats drifting in toward a town. Sometimes the railroad passed through a region of peat bogs, where frequent groups of men were at work digging out the black bricks of earth and laying them in the sunshine to dry. But these phases were incidental. In the main I saw a land highly cultivated and marked by a quaint pastoral beauty, akin to that of southern England, and yet different. Apparently the ways of the people have imparted to the country an individuality not due to either climate or soil. For one thing, the English and the French differ in their taste as to trees. The former like the sturdy oaks and elms. The latter prefer the slender poplars, and the prevalence of these trees gives the French landscape a delicacy and a lightness that are very charming. I noticed that every grade crossing on the railways was guarded by gates, and that when our train swept past there was always a woman standing just inside the gates with a brass horn in one hand, while in the other she held rigidly erect a stick about which a red flag was wound. This woman is the crossing guard. She and her family live close by in a small cottage that proclaims itself railroad property by having a mammoth number painted on it. Just before the passing of each train, the woman closes the gates, blows a warning on her horn for the benefit of any travelers who may be approaching on the highway, and then gets herself into that petrified attitude of military attention that one observes from the car window as the train flies by her. At first the French method of guarding crossings seemed perfunctory and ludicrous, but it makes them safe. In our own land our country roads as a rule cross the tracks at grade perfectly unobstructed, and when the view is limited by buildings or trees or hills, you cannot drive over a railroad without feeling that there are frightful possibilities in so doing. There was, however, one French railroad regulation that I could not regard otherwise than as a curiosity: the custom they have of starting all trains 5 minutes later than the scheduled time. It is supposed that this makes the public more certain of catching trains, but as all travelers perfectly understand the ruse, they naturally give themselves the benefit of the 5 minutes, and the gain is nullified. Of the towns I visited in my early journeying, the most interesting was Falaise in Normandy, in whose ancient castle the cruel King John of England at one time held prisoner his little nephew, Prince Arthur. It was thence the youthful prince was taken to meet his mysterious death, no one knows where or how. I reached Falaise in the late evening. Several omnibuses were waiting at the station entrance, and I picked out a driver who gave me to understand that at his hotel the folk talked English. With this assurance I gladly stepped inside his vehicle, and he drove away over the stony streets far back into the town. I suppose I misunderstood my driver as to the linguistic abilities of the hotel people. He probably only meant to intimate in a general way that at his hotel everything was perfect, for when we arrived not a word could I get out of any of them but French. However, I parleyvooed lamely to a well-meaning middle-aged maid till she caught the idea that I wanted a room, whereupon she conducted me to an apartment with alacrity, and my trials for that day were over. The first thing in the morning when I came downstairs, I met in the hallway the maid with whom I had talked the evening before, and she very agreeably motioned me to the kitchen. I expected to get something to eat, but instead the woman produced some blacking brushes, set a low chair out in the middle of the floor, and motioned at my shoes. She wanted to remove the dust and give them a polishing, and I put a foot on the chair and let her work. I had the feeling I ought to be doing the job myself, but the language presented too great difficulties, and I was helpless in her hands. I spent most of the day in walking about the village. It was the strangest old place I had ever seen. The crooked lanes and highways ran uphill and downhill at random, and street walks, dwellings, and public buildings were all of a gray stone, much worn and stained and indicating great age. Indeed, the aspect of the village was so venerable I felt as if it had just been exhumed from the medieval past, and the people in their quaint costumes and with their antiquated modes of living only served to make this impression more emphatic. A good deal of sewing, knitting, and weaving was going on in the homes, and when I looked in at open doors I often saw heaps of cloth and newly made garments. There were women spinning on old-time wheels, and men knitting with machines they ran by hand. The town had known prosperity, but now it was decayed and poverty-stricken, and no wonder, for how was it possible by these out-of-date hand methods to compete with modern machinery? Falaise, like most French towns, is very dirty. This seemed in part due to the uncleanly habits of the people themselves, in part to the entire lack of any sewer system worthy the name. Sluggish rivulets coursed along the street gutters, and these, clogged with kitchen refuse and street garbage, were equally offensive to the sense of smell and light. It was market day, and all the roads from the outer world were enlivened with teams driving in from the country, and by women on foot carrying big baskets on their arms full of butter and eggs. The market square was crowded with booths and strewn with heaps of vegetables and other merchandise, and the throng of buyers and sellers bargaining there, with a gray old church looking down on them, made a scene full of movement and picturesqueness. The townsmen of the lower classes and nearly all the men from the farms wore loose blue smocks, and the women of the same rank wore white caps that were sometimes of plain cloth and very like nightcaps, and at other times were of lace and elaborately frilled. Boys frequently wore blue frocks, the same as the men, and about half the youngsters wandered around without hats. These costumes were not peculiar to Falaise, but are to be found, with some local variations, everywhere in France. Through the center of the town ran a small mill stream, and here and there along it, among the homes of the poorer people, were washing places and women at work scrubbing dirty clothing. Each washing place had a broad, heavy slab of stone on the borders of the stream, shelving down into the water. On this stone the workers kneeled in wooden trays that had high fronts and sides to protect them from splashings. The soiled garments were laid on the stone, rubbed with soap and a brush, and then pounded with wide-bladed wooden paddles. After a final rinsing and wringing out, the clothes were hung up to dry on lines and fences, or in some cases on trees and hedgerows. By following the stream to the borders of the town, I came to the ruin of the old castle. It crowns a precipice and overlooks on one side the clustering town buildings, and on the other a juicy meadow enclosed by wooded hillsides. King John's murder of the little prince, the story of which is interwoven with that of the castle, was one of the most somber of old-time tragedies, and I had the fancy it might have cast some sort of blight on the vicinity that would still be perceptible. But it has left no trace behind. Life flows on unruffled in the town, and nature round about is as sweet and peaceful as if the scenes it has witnessed has been gentle and good always. Rural France, as seen in the neighborhood of Falaise, and indeed everywhere in the Northwest, is unfailingly attractive. The slender trees, the mellow atmosphere, the simple ways and primitive dress of its people, all combine to render a country walk a succession of pictures, while to make the acquaintance of a country village for the first time is to have an experience full of delight and pleasure. My own first village was one in the neighborhood of Calais. I was following a roadway across several miles of open plain when I saw, far away to the left, a grove of tall trees, and lo, amid the foliage I noted twinklings of white walls, indicating that the trees concealed houses. This piqued my curiosity, and I went to investigate. Presently I entered the cool shadows of the grove, and there I found reposed the most charming, picturesque hamlet imaginable. I would have thought it the only one of its kind in the world, but I learned later that in its wooded seclusion, with the wide treeless fields surrounding, it was a typical French village of that section. Several narrow lanes checkered the wood with their irregular lines and linked house with house. The only place where the houses gathered in a close group was in the center of the grove, where stood a little church, so hidden by trees that you would never suspect its existence from a dozen rods' distance. Both the barns and the houses, as a rule, had wattled walls of straw and mud with roofs of tile or thatch. Except for a tarred strip a couple of feet wide around the base, the mud walls were whitewashed. They appear very neat when in good repair, but they are so thin that rents are easily made in them, and where the breaks are not repaired promptly, the mud keeps dropping away from the straw decays, and a neglected building soon falls entirely to pieces. The houses were set at haphazard along the crooked village lanes, usually snug to the wheel tracks. If a yard intervened, it was pretty sure to be of hummocked and hard-trodden earth, with straw and other litter lying about. The space before the house door looked more like a barnyard than anything else. Often it contained a filthy pool where the green scum gathered. The hens made the yard their scratching place, and the pigs took it for their wallowing ground. Hog pens and chicken roosts and stable were right by the door, or even under the same roof as the living rooms. The smells were anything but sweet, yet there was so much that was delightful to the eye in the surroundings of these human sties that one was ready to forget the odors and the filth. The village ways were lined by high hedges, and everywhere were rows of tall trees, many of them without a branch until you came to a little tuft at the tip-top. It is the custom in France to let the shoots grow out thickly along the tree trunks, and as often as they get to be 8 or 10 feet long, they are clipped off and used for firewood. To do the clipping, a man straps some spikes to his legs to aid him in climbing, and struggles up to the topmost boughs, where he begins sawing off the limbs and working his way downward. The larger sprouts are marketable as bean poles. All the lesser stuff is tied up in bundles that sell for about a cent apiece. In Holland, tree shoots are utilized just as in France, only there the trees are cut short off about a dozen feet from the ground, and the sprouts grow out at the top in a great bushy head. In England, too, material of the same grade is an article of commerce, but the English have still another method of producing it. They let a field grow to brush, and when the brush reaches the required height, it is cut, made into bundles, the same as are the tree clippings in France, and in like manner sold for kindling wood. In America we count all such material rubbish, and burn it as worthless. The effect of the French treatment of their trees is to make each individual tree, in the near view, remind one of a worn-out broom set wrong end up, but in the aggregate it gives the landscape a peculiar grace and interest. Round about the little house of worship that nestled among the shadows in the heart of the grove of my first village was a small churchyard, overgrown with rank weeds and grasses. A few of the graves had headstones, and one a slender cross of iron some 9 feet high, much rusted, and bearing a figure of Christ minus a head. But most of the mounds were unmarked or were distinguished by nothing more than slight wooden crosses. The graves were very generally decorated with beadwork wreaths, either laid on the ground or hung on the crosses and headstones. These wreaths were often 2 feet in diameter, great, strange, artificial rosettes, distressingly elaborate, glittering, and high-colored, and in the center of the finer ones was an oval space under glass in which was a Christ on the cross, or perhaps a bead willow tree drooping over a tomb. A large share of the wreaths had been so long exposed to the weather that they were getting shabby, and the earth beneath them was strewn with their fragments. Funeral decorations in our own country are frequently curious and lacking in taste, but I never have seen anything with us quite so grotesque as these bead wreaths of France. The village was so quiet and quaint and sheltered that it seemed as though it had fallen into a drowsy sleep that had perhaps lasted hundreds of years, in which time the march of civilization with all its changes had left this little spot untouched. The people did not seem very busy, at least they had plenty of time to visit with each other and to watch me, but I was most impressed with their leisureliness by a hair-cutting scene I witnessed. It employed the energies of a whole family, either as actors or onlookers. There was a small boy who was being shorn, his father who did the clipping, his mother who held him, and his sister, uncle, and grandfather who watched proceedings. It seemed a large force for the work in hand, but I think they all enjoyed it, with the possible exception of the boy. House doors were open, and I glanced into several of the cottage kitchens. There was little to see, a few scanty furnishings, a great fireplace, and sometimes a colony of chickens picking familiarly about the apartment. Frequently there was no other floor than one of rough, hard-trodden earth, very well suited to the chickens, I thought, but not to the human inhabitants, if they had any aspirations toward cleanliness. The only ambitions of this sort that I discovered were concentrated on the outer walls of the cottages, which were often models of neatness, as white above as whitewash could make them, and as black along the base as applications of tar would permit. It was springtime, and apparently the height of the house furbishing season, for in my wanderings about the village I saw women patching rents in the walls with mud, women whitewashing, and one woman, who had finished her work with the brush, was wiping off the spatters that had fallen on the tarred strip below. When I left the village I went out of the grove at the opposite side from the one by which I entered, and a short walk brought me to a broad highway. Where the lane from the village joined this highway stood a house built of stone, that looked as if it might be an inn. A good many people were gathered in the vicinity, and as I drew near I saw that a funeral was in progress. The wide front doorway was framed about with white cloth trimmed with green vines and leaves. This gave entrance, not to the room within, but to a little section of it that had been walled off into a white grotto-like space in which the coffin rested, adorned with many of the queer artificial wreaths of glass beadwork. In front of the house in the roadway stood a group of black-gowned, white-capped women, and beyond them, in a group distinctly separate, were a number of men. Presently a priest with a crucifix and a sexton with a long staff appeared, both in robes and bareheaded, and a short service in the open air was begun at the white doorway. Just then a heavy cart came lumbering along the highway, but it stopped at a respectful distance, and the driver took off his hat and waited with bowed head till the procession formed to go to the grave. The priest, chanting as he walked, led with the sexton close behind. Then came the coffin with 4 women bearers, then several women carrying bead wreaths. The other women followed, and the men brought up the rear. The heavy cart now resumed its rumble along the highway, but I stayed to watch the procession wend through the green lane and enter the cool depths of the village grove. It was lost to sight at length, the chant of the priest died away, and I heard only a skylark singing in the sunset light far up toward the clouds. End of Chapter 1 of Along French Byways. How the World is Housed by Frank G. Carpenter. First chapter, collection 9. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Betty B. How the World is Housed. Chapter 1. Introduction. This book is to be the record of the doings of a party of children who are to travel with the author over this big round earth. Each one who reads it is to imagine himself one of the party, and we are to go together over the oceans and across the mountains and plains, looking at and learning about the world for ourselves. There will be so much to see that we must keep our eyes wide open. We shall carry cameras with us to photograph the most interesting sights, and our pencils and notebooks must be always at hand to write down the things we wish to remember and tell to our people at home. We shall travel without an object. The world is so large and it has so much to show us that we might spend our whole lives in journeying over it and not see it at all. So it is best to take up one class of things at a time and devote our journeys to that. In other books of this series, we have already gone over the globe to learn how the world is fed and how it is clothed. In our present travels, we shall try to find out how it is housed. We shall peep into the dwellings of our little brothers and sisters of other races in different parts of the earth, and see how they live. We want to know how their houses are made and furnished. We would also learn as to our own homes and how they are constructed, and we shall go to the places from where the building materials come and see how they are prepared for our shelter and comfort. All this will require many long journeys. We shall travel over the various grand divisions and explore many parts of them. We shall go into the mighty forests to see where the wood comes from, to the quarries to watch men getting out the granite, marble, and other building stones, and perhaps descend below ground to learn about this iron, copper, tin, and other metals used in putting them together. We shall visit factories and foundries of many kinds and find that thousands of people all over the world are always at work in the industry of making our houses. We shall see the great part that commerce has to do with preparing the materials and bringing them to the places where they are required for building, as well as in erecting the structures. Our travels will therefore be along the two great lines of industry and commerce, which have so much to do with our own employment and comfort. Before we start out, however, let us have a little talk about those people who lived long ago before houses, as we know them, existed. No one can tell just what was the first language spoken, or just where was the first place on earth that man lived, and in the same way it is hard to say what the first house was like. We believe that all mankind were originally savages. They either went naked or dressed in skins or leaves, and in all probability their earliest shelters were the wide-spreading trees of the forests in which they lived. They crowded around the trunks of the trees to keep out of the sun and the rain, and climbed into the branches to be safe from the wild animals that might attack them. In the winter they sought out caves in the rocks and holes in the earth on account of the cold, often driving out the savage beasts who had their homes there. After a short time man learned to make shelters of branches covered with leaves or grass, and then to twist the branches together and chink them with mud into huts. He roofed these rude shelters with grass or the skins of the wild animals he was able to trap, and finally learned how to sew the skins into tents. Indeed, there are many people now living in the more savage parts of the world who have shelters as rude as those of our ancestors of long ago days. For instance, in the islands around the Strait of Magellan, at the southern end of South America, I have seen natives who go almost naked. They have no villages nor fixed habitations and move about fishing and hunting, making rude shelters wherever they stop. They choose a bushy spot and, bending the branches together, tie them at the top. They then break off other branches and lean them against this framework, making a little tent about 3 feet high into which they crawl to sleep at night. Their food is fish and mussels and such small animals as they can trap and kill with their bows and arrows. They have no stoves and cook on fires in the open air. They are wild savages and live but little better than beasts. It is much the same with the tribes of black people who inhabit the wilder parts of Australia. They make their shelters by tearing off pieces of bark from the fallen trees and leaning them against one another. The pygmies of the great forests of the Congo in the heart of Central Africa have no better homes. They are black dwarfs, so small that the full-grown men and women are no taller than American boys and girls of 12 and 13. They wear almost no clothing, and but few of them have permanent homes. Most of these little people travel about from place to place, sleeping upon the ground or in the branches of trees. Some of them dwell in caves, and others in rude huts of bark, which they erect where they stop. A few of the tribes have villages or collections of such shelters. The ordinary pygmy house is so low that we can hardly stand upright within it, and the entrances are such that the little owners themselves have to crawl in. It is usually of an oblong shape with 2 doors, one in front and one behind, so that the pygmies may run out the back if attacked at the front. The houses are formed of branches stuck into the ground so that they lean towards one another. They are tied at the top, and the sides and top are rudely thatched with leaves and grass. They have no furniture. The pygmies sleep upon the ground or on beds of leaves. They live upon roots and by trapping and hunting. their weapons being bows and poisoned arrows. Very similar to these people are our own little brown cousins, the Negritos, or black dwarfs of the Philippine Islands. They wander about from place to place, putting up shelters to sleep under when night overtakes them. They sometimes dwell in caves or holes in the rocks, and we may suppose that their homes are much the same as those of our race before it began to be civilized. Caves have been found in England, France, and in other parts of Europe in which man once dwelt, and in them the tools of bone and flint which he then used. In some places our ancestors of the long ago days cut homes for themselves out of the soft rock, and even now in the Loess country of western China there are people who dwell in similar homes. The soil there is many feet deep and of such a nature that the streams and roads have cut deep ravines through it, the walls of which are almost perpendicular. In these walls the people have made rooms and fitted in doors and windows, forming dwellings which are comfortable and not at all damp. Not far from the Gulf of Gabes in Tunis, on the edge of the desert of Sahara, are tribes which have similar homes in the cliffs. In the southwestern part of our country are to be found the remains of the Indian cliff dwellers, who lived in the crevices of the cliffs which they walled up with stone, and still farther south in Mexico are other cliff dwellers. In the northern parts of Alaska, the Eskimos built their winter homes half underground, roofing them with snow and digging passages below the earth through which they go in and out. In many newly settled countries, the pioneers often use caves as dwellings until they can erect more comfortable homes, and there are now houses made of sod and clay in different parts of our West, which are almost like caves. Returning again to that long ago time when men were but little better than savages, we may suppose one of them grew tired of his cave home or brush tent and tried to make a permanent shelter which the rain could not enter nor the wind blow away. To do this he piled up stones into rude walls, and made a roof of some kind above them, thus constructing the first hut or real house. His fellows did likewise, and step by step man discovered how to make the foundations, to improve the roofs, and to form the doors and openings for light and air. The first tools were of stone, bone, horn, and wood. Later, as man learned how to work in metal, he made implements of copper and bronze, and after many ages of iron and steel. As the tools became better, the shelters steadily improved. The stones were cut into blocks and the trees chopped into logs. After a time, smooth walls of stone or wood were constructed and roofed with flat stones or hewn boards, and afterwards with shingles and slate. Then somebody discovered how to make bricks, and plaster and cement came. By and by the secrets of glassmaking were learned, and step by step invention marched along with industry until the rude huts became houses and the villages grew into cities. Civilized man then began to make temples and palaces and mighty structures of every description. The work of improvement went on in small buildings as well as in great, until we now have our wonderful homes made of materials gathered by commerce from all parts of the world, and by industry so combined that they give us all the comforts and conveniences of modern life. In our travels we shall find races and tribes who are now living in the many different stages through which man has risen in making a home for himself, and by our imagination can see how our ancestors lived when they were passing through these same conditions. Moreover, by observing the ruins left by the people of those long ago days, we shall learn something of the houses in which they dwelt. End of chapter 1 of How the World is Housed.
Isabel d'Aragão, A Rainha Santa. First chapter, collection 9. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Isabel d'Aragão, A Rainha Santa. Capítulo 1. Nascimento da Rainha Santa. Da corte de Aragão ao trono de Portugal. A rainha Santa Isabel, que Coimbra se ufana de ter como desvelada protetora e valiosa padroeira, nasceu na cidade de Saragossa, na Espanha, no ano de 1271. Filha do príncipe real Dom Pedro de Aragão e de sua esposa, Dona Constança. O seu nascimento foi desde logo iluminado pela graça divina, pois que seu avô é o rei Dom Jaime, que até aí vivia em grande discórdia com Dom Pedro de Aragão, imediatamente se congraçou com este, passando ambos a viver na mais doce harmonia. Assim demonstrou Deus aos homens que esta menina estava reservada a ser na terra a medianeira da paz, o anjo predestinado a estabelecer a harmonia e a concórdia entre os desavindos. Fato que mais tarde, quando rainha de Portugal, se verificou nas diversas desavenças entre seu esposo el-rei Dom Dinis e seu filho Dom Afonso IV. A rainha Santa Isabel foi, como já dissemos, aureolada desde seu nascimento pela graça do Senhor. As suas preciosas virtudes bem cedo se revelaram, crescendo nela com a idade a fama que tanto a impôs à consideração de todas as cortes da Europa. Fato que despertou em bastantes príncipes o desejo de possuírem como esposa tão excelsa senhora. Foi à corte de Portugal, felizmente, que coube a suprema aventura de ser a preferida entre todas as outras, merecendo el-rei Dom Dinis a glória de ter como consorte um tesouro de tantas virtudes e de tão preciosos encantos. O casamento de Dom Dinis com Dona Isabel celebrou-se por procuração na antiga cidade de Barcelona, tendo lugar este ato no dia 11 de fevereiro de 1282, e contando a futura rainha de Portugal apenas 11 anos de idade. Este auspicioso enlace constituiu um motivo de grande regozijo para todos os portugueses, antevendo estes os enormes benefícios deste casamento, o qual foi muito festejado e aclamado em todo o país com demonstrações de grande alegria e verdadeira satisfação. A saída de Dona Isabel para Portugal causou a seus pais grandes tristezas, custando-lhes imenso essa separação, pelas profundas saudades que Dona Isabel deixava em todos os corações que muito a estremeciam. De Espanha até Coimbra, foi a excelsa rainha delirantemente aclamada por todo o povo que acorria à sua passagem, salientando-se mais essas carinhosas manifestações na antiga vila de Trancoso, onde no dia 24 de junho de 1282, no templo de São Bartolomeu, se celebraram com toda a pompa as bênçãos nupciais. Em Coimbra, onde a esse tempo residia a corte, juntamente com a principal nobreza do reino, as manifestações de contentamento e alegria pela chegada dos régios nubentes atingiram o mais delirante entusiasmo, conquistando logo a rainha Dona Isabel a simpatia e o amor de um povo que mais tarde havia de herdar o seu mais precioso tesouro, o sagrado corpo que todos hoje veneramos e que esta cidade conserva com a mais desvelada e respeitosa devoção. As manifestações de regozijo com que a cidade recebeu os régios consortes foram, pois, verdadeiramente grandiosas, vestindo a cidade as suas melhores galas, para bem lhe significar o contentamento de que se achava possuída por motivo daquele enlace, cujos efeitos tanto se evidenciaram na vida da nação portuguesa, e de que Coimbra comparticipou em larga escala pelos benéficos atos de caridade que a Santa Rainha espalhou por toda a parte. Foi nesta cidade, principalmente, que Dona Isabel de Aragão manifestou mais claramente a pureza da sua alma, os atos de caridade que praticou, os socorros por ela prestados à indigência, aos órfãos, às viúvas e às donzelas abandonadas. Foram os primeiros lavores que lhe teceram a sua coroa de glória, a fundação de asilos, de albergues e de hospitais, que a sua magnificência sustentou e onde se recolhia uma legião de infelizes, Originou sem dúvida a fama de santidade que bem cedo a distinguiu e que mais tarde, a 25 de maio de 1625, dia da Santíssima Trindade, a Igreja confirmou, englobando-a no número dos eleitos do Senhor. End of Chapter 1. Isabel de Aragão, a Rainha Santa.
Quincas Borba, de Machado de Assis. First Chapter, Collection 9. This is a librivox recording. All librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Gabriele, Brasil. Quincas Borba, capítulo 1. Rubião fitava a enseada. Eram 8 horas da manhã. Quem o visse, com os polegares metidos no cordão do chambre, à janela de uma grande casa do Botafogo, cuidaria que ele admirava aquele pedaço de água quieta. Mas, em verdade, vos digo que pensava em outra coisa, cortejava o passado com o presente, que era, há 1 ano, professor, que é agora capitalista. Olha para si, para as chinelas, umas chinelas de túnis que lhe deu o recente amigo Cristiano Palha, para a casa, para o jardim, para a enseada, para os morros e para o céu. E tudo, desde as chinelas até o céu, tudo entra na mesma sensação de propriedade. Vejam como Deus escreve direito por linhas tortas, pensa ele. Se a mana Piedade tem casado com Quincas Borba, apenas me daria uma esperança colateral. Não casou, ambos morreram, e aqui está tudo comigo. De modo que o que parecia uma desgraça... End of Chapter 1 of Quincas Borba.
Poranek wiosenny świtał nad czarną lasów ławą, otaczającą widnokrąg dokoła. W powietrzu czuć było woń liści i traw młodych, zlanych rosą, świeżo w ciągu kilku takich poranków z nabrzmiałych pączków rozkwitych. Nad strumieniami wezbranymi jeszcze resztką wiosennej powodzi złociły się łotocie, jak bogate szycie na zielonym kobiercu. Wschód słońca poprzedzała uroczysta cisza, tylko ptactwo zaczynało budzić się w gałęziach i niespokojnie zrywało się z noclegów. Już słychać było świergot i świsty i nawoływania drobnej drużyny. Wysoko pod chmurami płynął orzeł siwy, kołując i upatrując pastwy na ziemi. Zawiesił się czasem w powietrzu i stał nieruchomy, a potem dalej majestatycznie żeglował. W worze coś zaszeleściło i umilkło. Stado dzikich kóz wyjrzało z gąszczy na polankę, popatrzało czarnymi oczyma i pierzchnęło, zatętniało za nimi. Cicho znowu. Z drugiej strony słychać łamiące się gałęzie, zaszeleściał łoś rogaty, wyjrzał, podniósł głowę, powietrza pociągnął chrapami, zadumiał się, potarł rogami po grzbiecie i zwolna poszedł w las nazad. I znowu słychać było łom gałęzi i ciężkie stąpanie. Spod gęstych łóz zaświeciło oczów dwoje. Wilk ciekawie rozglądał się po okolicy. Tuż poza nim, położywszy uszy, pierzchnął przelękły zając. Skoczył parę razy i przycupnął. I milczenie było. Tylko z dala ozwała się poranna muzyka lasów. Trąciło o nie skrzydło wiosennego powiewu i gałęzie grać zaczęły. Każde drzewo grało inaczej, a ucho mieszkańca puszcz rozeznać mogło szmer brzozy z listki młodemi, drżenie osiczyny bojaźliwe, skrzypienie dębów suchych, szum sosen i żałośliwe jodeł szelesty. Szedł wiatr, stąpając po wierzchołkach puszczy i głośniej coraz odpowiadały mu bory, coraz bliżej, silniej coraz muzyka grała pieśnią poranną. Ponad lasy płynęły zarumienione chmury, jak dziewczęta, które się ze snu zerwały, zbudzone i uciekały, czując, że obcy pan nadchodzi. Szare zrazu niebo błękitniało u góry, pozłacało się u dołu. Obłoczki, białe jak z rąbku obsłonki pościeli, rozwiewał wiatr po lazurach. Słońce strzeliło promieniami ku górze. Noc uciekała. Widać było ostatki cieniów i mroków roztapiające się w dnia blasku. Nad strumieniami i łąkami, jak dymy ofiarne, zakipiały pary przejrzyste, ulatując zwolna ku niebu i ginąc w powietrzu. Ukośne promienie słońca ciekawie zaglądały w głębiny, śledząc, co się przez noc rozrosło, zazieleniało, wykwitło. Razem z szumem lasu zawtórował chór ptaków, wszczął się gwar wielki. Ożyły w świetle łąki, zarośla, puszcze i powietrzne szlaki. Wracało życie. W promieniach wirowały, zwijały się, kręciły niespokojne, skrzydlate dzieci powietrza, coś szczebiocące do siebie, do chmur i do lasów. Kukułki odezwały się z dala, dzięcioły, kowale już kuły drzewa. Był dzień. U skraju lasu, nad rzeką leniwą, która go przerzynała, wśród gęstych drzew, gdzie cień schował się jeszcze, widać było kupkę gałęzi, niby szałas na prędce sklecony, kilka kołków wbitych w ziemię, a na nich nacięte konary jodłowe. Obok, tuż, było wygasłe ognisko, spopielałe i kilka w niem niedopalonych głowni. Poniżej, w zielonych, bujnych trawach, na sznurach do kołów poprzywiązywanych, pasły się dwa małe, grube, gęstym i najeżonym jeszcze zimowym włosem okryte konie. Szelest jakiś w lesie znać je nastraszył, poznały nieprzyjaciela, nastawiły uszu, rozdeły chrapy, zaczęły niecierpliwie nogami kopać ziemię, jeden z nich zarżał, a echo po lesie poniosło ten dziki głos, który się rozlegał i powtórzył słabiej za łąką. Z szałasu pokazała się głowa, cała włosami okryta długiemi, zarosła rudo. Dwoje oczów ciemnych skierowało się naprzód ku koniom, potem ku niebu, ruch się dał słyszeć pod gałęziami. Wkrótce potem, rozgarniając je, wydobył się spod nich człowiek słusznego wzrostu, krępy i barczysty. Długiem leżeniem i snem skostniałe wyciągnął członki. Ziewnął, strząsnął się, popatrzał na niebo, potem na konie. Te zobaczywszy go, zwolna zaczęły się zbliżać ku niemu. Nadstawił uszu bacznie. Nic słychać nie było, prócz szumu lasu, śpiewu ptactwa, mruku strumienia. Człowiek wyglądał dziko. Włos bujny, poplątany, spływał mu kudłami na barki i osłaniał niskie czoło tak, że oczy wprost spod nich patrzały. Resztka twarzy także była zarosła, ledwie część policzków, zarumienionych snem i chłodem, dobywała się spod wąsów i brody, wśród których ust prawie znać nie było. Sukienna, wełniana, gruba odzież brunatnego koloru okrywała mu ramiona, pod szyją spięta na guz i pętlę. Nogi miał też suknem i skórą poobkręcane, a stopy obwite nią i pasane sznurami. Spod rękawów sukni krótkich dobywały się ręce silne, włosem okryte i opalone. Twarz miała wyraz przebiegły, na wpół zwierzęcy, na wpół człowieczy, zuchwały razem i ostrożny. Oczy biegały żywo. Ruchy ciała zręczne i silne nie dawały wieku odgadnąć, choć młodość już pozostawił za sobą. Postawszy chwilę, mężczyzna wrócił ku szałasowi i nogą silnie kopnął w ścianę jego, nie mówiąc słowa. Poruszyło się coś żywo za gałęźmi i wnet spod nich wypełzło chłopie. Wydobyło się zza liści, zerwało rzeźko na nogi. Wyrostek mógł mieć lat z 15, krzepki był i nieco do starego podobny. Twarz mu jeszcze nie porastała, włosy miał krótko ucięte, odzież grubą, a wyszarganą, z sukna i płóciennych chust złożoną. Na nogi wstawszy, oczy przetarł kułakami, ledwie miał czas resztkę snu z powiek opędzić, gdy starszego głos chropawy, w mowie dziwnej, obcej, której na ziemi nikt, prócz nich dwu, nie rozumiał, zawołał: Gerda, do koni, słońce weszło. Usłyszawszy ten rozkaz, poparty lekkiem potrąceniem w plecy, chłopiec zbiegł ku koniom, odwiązał sznury, skoczył na grzbiet z nich jednemu i poprowadził je o kilka kroków dalej, gdzie trochę piaszczystego, suchego brzegu do wody przystęp dawało. Na piasku widać też było ślady kopyt koni, które już tam wprzódy napoju szukały. Konie zaczęły pić chciwie. Chłopię siedzące na jednym ziewało, z ukosa poglądając ku staremu, który około szałasu się krzątał, mrucząc coś sam do siebie. Była li to poranna modlitwa? Na ostatek konie napojone podniosły głowy i jak zadumane słuchały lasów szumu. Chłopak je sznurem pognał ku szałasowi. Tu już nagotowane leżały suknem i skórką poobwijane juki, które starszy począł na konie zarzucać i przywiązywać. Milczący pomagał mu wyrostek. Na grzbiety koniom zawieszono sukno grube i skóry. Gdy wszystko było w pogotowiu, stary wlazł jeszcze pod szałas i po chwili wyszedł z niego uzbrojony. U pasa miał siekierkę jak młot grubą, krótki nóż w pochwie skórzanej, na plecach łuk, przez drugie ramię procę i krótką pałkę drewnianą krzemieniem nabijaną, którą przed sobą uczepił na boku. Chłopak też ściągnął swój oręż z ziemi, nóż do pasa i siekierkę, którą do ręki wziął, lekko na grzbiet konia wskakując. Starszy się jeszcze obejrzał na noclegowisko, patrząc, czy czego nie zapomniał daniem. Rękami popróbował sakiew na grzbiecie powiązanych i konia swego pod kłodę poprowadziwszy, skoczył nań zręcznie. Już mieli ruszyć z miejsca i starszy się rozglądał, aby wybrać drogę, gdy z gęstwiny naprzeciw, rozgartując ostrożnie leszczynę i kaliny, niepostrzeżona, po cichu wysunęła się głowa ludzka. Ciekawie, zrazu z jakąś obawą, dwoje oczu jasnych przypatrywało się podróżnym. Zza gałęzi widać tylko było włos płowy, co je otaczał, młodą twarz, ledwie zarostem pokrytą, białe zęby w ustach, na pół podziwieniem otwartych. Podróżny tymczasem ku słońcu poglądał i na bieg rzeki. Ponad jej brzegami drogi żadnej śladu widać nie było. Zdawał się chcieć upewnić, czy mają przebrnąć, czy z nią, czy przeciw niej się puścić. Konie rwały się już do pochodu niecierpliwe, obrócone na wschód łbami. Starszy pomyślał trochę, oczyma łąkę zmierzył, trzęsawiska i bór, potem zwrócił się na piaszczyste wybrzeże, kędy konie pojono. Tu stanąwszy, myślał pewnie, czy bród znajdzie, bo oczy utopił w wodzie, jakby mierzył jej głębinę. Byłby teraz i tę głowę mógł dojrzeć w krzakach, co go szpiegowała, ale się ostrożnie schowała, tylko gałązki opadły i drżały. Powoli konie wchodziły w wodę, która tu nie była grząską ni głęboką. Zanurzyły się po brzuchy, zdawało się, że popłyną, ale tuż się znalazła ława piaszczysta i oto już brzeg drugi. Oba podróżni wylądowali szczęśliwie, ledwie pomoczywszy nogi. Drugim brzegiem, wyższym nieco i suchszym, wygodniej kroczyć było, choć tuż, za gęstwiną coś szeleściło dziwnie. Zwierz spłoszony, myślał podróżny. Na oku, oprócz noclegowiska, śladu człowieka nie dostrzegło oko, bór jak go stworzył Bóg. Ku niebu wyrosły bujno, pnie grube jak słupy proste, oschłe z gałęzi od dołu, u góry w zielone wieńce ubrane. Gdzieniegdzie zwalona burzą kłoda, na wpół przegniła, pół skory opadła, pogięte od wichru wyrostki i poschłe od zgrzybiałości mchami, jak futrem na starość odziane olbrzymy. Jechali. Na wzgórzu coś bielało nieopodal. Pod dębem leżał kamień wyżłobiony jak misa, nad nim drugi stał, gruby i niezgrabny. Ręka niewprawna wrzeźbiła na nim jakby ludzką twarz straszliwą, czapką okrytą u góry. Starszy wstrzymał się trochę, zobaczywszy znak u drogi, obejrzał niespokojnie dokoła i mijając go splunął nań z pogardą. W tej chwili świst się dał słyszeć dziwny z krzaków i drzewce ze strzały utkwiło na piersi, w grubej sukmanie starszego. Ledwie poczuwszy pocisk, nie wiedząc jeszcze, czy się do broni ma brać, czy do ucieczki, obracał głowę, gdy chłopak krzyknął. Druga strzała utkwiła mu w nodze. A z lasu dał się słyszeć śmiech, śmiech dziki jakiś, straszny, jakby wycie zwierzęce, niby okrzyk człowieka. Zachichotało, rozległo się, zamilkło. Sroka siedziała na kamieniu, na czapce i podniósłszy skrzydła krzyczała, śmiechowi wtórując, a miotała się, jakby i ona groziła. Konie, głosami temi podżegnięte, pośpieszyły kroku, ale nieprzyjaciela już ani widać, ani słychać nie było. Cisza panowała nad lasami, drzewa tylko uroczyście szumiały. Starszy mężczyzna kłusował naprzód, konia pędząc skoro. Chłopak, który strzałę wyszarpnął z nogi, śpieszył za nim, pochylony na szyi swojego. Przebiegli tak stai kilkoro, aż nie słysząc nic, nie widząc pogoni, zwolnili kroku. Starszy się dopiero obejrzał na chłopca ze zbladłą twarzą, z zaciętymi usty, z wytrzeszczonymi oczyma, przylgłego do konia. Nie miał nawet czasu od strzały tkwiącej w piersi się uwolnić. Przebiła ona sukno i znać uwięzła w ciele, bo choć w szybkim biegu ugięła się i opadła ku dołowi, trzymała się jeszcze. Tu dopiero na polance, konia ściągnąwszy, starszy obejrzał się na strzałę i zręcznie ją pocisnąwszy, choć syknął z bólu, wydobył, obejrzał ciekawie i do skórzanego na plecach worka wsunął. Strzała miała z kości białej wyrobione ostrze cienkie, na którego końcu widać było krwi kropelkę. Pioruny by w nich biły i burze, zawołał warcząc Rudy. Gdzieś się w krzakach znalazło oko, co podpatrzyło i pomściło za bałwana. Tyś ranny w nogę, Gerda? Chłopak z oczyma jeszcze obłąkanymi i trwogą, milcząc, na nogę skaleczoną wskazywał. Rana jego głębsza była, bo płachty nie wstrzymały strzały. No, nic to, jedna strzała polańska. zamruczał starszy, oni ich nie zatruwają. Obawiałem się, aby ich tam więcej nie było. Znać jeden rozbójnik, niestraszny. Nie ważył się, zobaczywszy, żeśmy zbrojni. Ale może nawołać innych, narobić wrzawy, uchodzić trzeba. Spojrzał na słońce. Trzymaj się konia, a puść go za mną. Śpieszyć trzeba, żeby nas w tym nie zaskoczyli lesie, póki nie dojedziemy do znajomych. Z południa na miejscu będziemy. Chłopak milczał, starszy coś mruczał jeszcze, ku górze patrzał. Konia sznurem ściągnął i polecieli gęstwiną, nad brzegiem się ciągle trzymając, bez drogi. Rzeka gościniec znaczyła. Puszcza wciąż była dzika, nie zamieszkała, milcząca. Raz z dala na wodzie postrzegli jakby głowę ludzką z ciemnym, przylgłym do niej włosem i dwoje rąk wiosłujących około niej. Lecz gdy się tentent dał słyszeć, znikła. Wir tylko było widać nad powierzchnią wody. Minęli ją i wyszli znowu z głębiny. Na włosach czarnych dokoła opleciony był wianek złotoci. Oczyma strzelała za niemi. Trochę dalej, czółno maleńkie jak łupinka, ślizgało się płynąc z biegiem. Ponad niem białą chustkę widać było. Gdy tentent dał się słyszeć, znikła płachta na dnie i czółenko, jak wąż, wsunęło się między trzciny, łozy, wiszary, których tylko wierzchy się chwiały. Kilka kaczek zerwało się przestraszonych, wyciągnęło szyję, sznurem leciały gdzieś dalej, plusnęły i padły. Podróżni wciąż biegli brzegiem, to szybciej, to wolniej, 2 razy konie poili zmęczone i jechali dalej bez spoczynku. A słońce też podnosiło się coraz wyżej, grzało coraz mocniej. Choć w lesie świeżo było i chłodno, od łąk i piasków zalatywał oddech gorący. Nie zmieniła się okolica. Bór ciągle szumiał nad rzeką. Gdzieniegdzie, w piasku, między pagórkami świeciło jeziorko, szerzej rozlewały się wody, to ściskały wśród parowu. Mieniały się tylko drzewa, sosny i jodły, potem zielonych liści brzozy i lipy, i osiki, i dęby, na pół jeszcze śpiące, a głuche na wiosnę. Gdzieniegdzie żółtawą ławą leżał piasek, to kępiasta trzęsawica, którą okrążać musieli. Przed niemi z dala pomykał zwierz, z łąk pierzchały całe stada łosi i jeleni, dobijając się do lasu, na którego z kraju stawszy, patrzyły jeszcze ciekawie i gnały dalej, znikając im z oczów. Naówczas łomot stad spłoszonych konie straszył i pędziły żywiej, stuliwszy uszu, póki sił stało. Gerda ciągle ręką chwytał za nogę zranioną, czuł, że mu krew ciekła, jakby ciepły sznurek wijący się aż do stopy i w skórzanym obuwiu zbierała się u nogi, czerwonymi kroplami sącząc szparami chodaka. Ale skarżyć się nie śmiał, zawijać rany chubą z drzew lub liśćmi, co by krew zatamowały, nie było czasu. Starszemu też trochę krwi pokazało się między palcami ręki, otarł je o końską grzywę, nie troszcząc się o to. Rozpatrywał się wciąż po okolicy, dawniej znać sobie pamiętnej, jakby szukając miejsca do spoczynku, lecz nierychło zwolnili biegu. Tu rzeka, płynąc nizinami równemi, szerzej się rozlewała, wzdłuż błot świeżą zielonością okrytych. Ze wzgórza nagiego, na którym stali, widać było łąki i trzęsawiska, wśród nich moczary i jeziorka mnogie, opasane gajami. Kilka strumieni zbiegało się tu z borów ku rzece. Las, wśród którego stanęli, wypalony był i zeschły na znacznej przestrzeni. Gąszcze, co go podszywały, spłonęły do szczętu. Daleko więc w głąb jego sięgnąć było można okiem i dojrzeć nieprzyjaciela. Tu starszy z konia się zsunął, rzucił go nie patrząc i legł na ciepłym piasku, obu rękami, pot kropliste ocierając z czoła. Zmęczony był, piersi mu się podnosiły, a że krwawymi palcami dotknął twarzy i ją też sobie całą okrwawił. Ujrzawszy to, chłopak uląkł się i krzyknął: Co ci to, Gerda? Czyś ty mężczyzna? Czy się matka twoja omyliła, że ci nie wdzięła chusty spódnicy? Kropla krwi, a tyle strachu i wrzasku? Chłopak mu dopiero wskazał na własną twarz jego. Nie o moją mi strach, rzekł, choć skórznie mam jej pełne, ale o waszą. Twarz, ojcze, macie we krwi całą. Starszy na ręce swe popatrzył, rozśmiał się tylko i nic nie odpowiedział. Gerda tymczasem na ziemi siadłszy, nogę ranną rozzuł i począł czyścić obuwie, a potem ranę ocierać i okładać chubą. Stary patrzał na to obojętnym okiem. W milczeniu dobyli potem z sakiew suszone mięso i placki, które starszy na ziemi rozłożył. Poszedł się wprzód obmyć we wodzie i dłonią ją do ust zaczerpnąć. Gerda za jego przykładem zwlókł się też do wody. Siedli jeść w milczeniu. Konie na chudej trawie leniwie się pasły. Z lasu wyleciała sroka. Uwiesiła się na suchej gałęzi nad głową starego, pochyliła się ku niemu i krzyczała. Zdawała się zagniewana, trzepała skrzydłami, podlatywała coraz bliżej, wołała coś, jakby na gwałt zbierając drugie. Nadciągnęła w pomoc wtóra i trzecia i wrzaskliwie to podlatywały, to przysiadywały się przy nich. Stary, który się chciał zdrzemnąć, zniecierpliwiony łuk napiął i strzelił. Nie ranił żadnej, zerwały się z krzykiem, zawirowały w powietrzu i wróciły krakać nad niemi. Gerda z głową zwieszoną, na rękach sparty, nad końmi czuwał. Las milczał, niebo było czyste, owad tylko, wywołany słońcem do życia, brzęczał, gromadami unosząc się w powietrzu. Po krótkim spoczynku na konie siedli znów. Stary się do chłopca zwrócił. O strzałach, o krwi, o niczem, ani słowa tam. Najlepiej byś nie mówił nic i niemego udawał. Niemcami oni nas tam zowią, choć my ich język rozumiemy. Słuchaj, co gadać będą, zda się to zawsze, ale udawaj, że ci ta mowa obca. Tak lepiej, milczeć. Spojrzał nań, czekając, by mu Gerda oczyma odpowiedział. Jechali dalej a dalej. Słońce już się zwolna spuszczać zaczynało ku zachodowi. Brzeg rzeki wyniosły, coraz się zniżał, wilgotniejsze otaczało ich powietrze. Cień zalegał bolu ściany. Gdy zdali, nad zaroślami, pokazał się słup dymu siny. Stary, zobaczywszy go, drgnął z radości czy niepokoju. Chłopak też weń w oczy wlepił i zwolnili koniom biegu. Dokoła się las rozlegał stary, wysoki, gęsty, a łąka nad rzeką zwężała, płynąca ścieśnionym korytem. W prawo otwarła się łąka, dokoła zasiekami drzew zrąbanych otoczona. Poza nią z szałasów jakichś, chałup z drzewa i chrustu, opasanych tynami wysokiemi, dobywał się ów słup siny. Zbliżając się ku budom, coraz je lepiej rozeznać można było. U brzegu podniesionego trochę rzeki stały w prostokąt szczelnie zewsząd zamknięte. Od łąki odgradzały je kłody drzew i tyny, pokopane doły i powbijane pale. Na jednym z nich tkwiła zawieszona, biała, od deszczu wypłukana, od słońca zwapniała czaszka końska. Dachy pokryte były kawałkami dartemi drzewa, wiszarem i gałęźmi. Ściany w słupy z chrustu plecione. Po środku tylko, z kłód ogromnych, w zrąb zbudowana, wznosiła się chałupa, dwór, do której szopy wkoło przytykały, z nią razem obejście tworząc, w środku którego małe znajdowało się podwórze. Dojeżdżając, rudy podróżny zwolnił koniowi biegu, oczyma szukając, czy kogo nie zobaczy. Nie widać było żywej duszy. Wahał się jeszcze, jak dać znać o sobie, gdy u brzegu rzeki, na ogromnym, zbłąkanym tu od wieków kamieniu, ujrzał siedzącego starca, który niepostrzeżony od dawna go śledził oczyma. Ubrany był cały w bieli, nic nie mając na sobie, prócz odzieży z płótna grubego. Nogi miał bose, głowę siwą nieokrytą. Ogromna, długa do pasa broda, piersi mu osłaniała. Biały, wysoki kij trzymał w ręku. Koszulę na wierzch włożoną i do kolan spadającą obejmował pas czerwony. Żadnej zresztą nie miał ani ozdoby, ani broni. U nóg jego dwa psy leżały, do wilków podobne, zaczajone, przypadłe do ziemi, oczyma krwawymi wiodące za podróżnymi. Drgały leżąc i czekając, kiedy się rzucą. Twarz starca spokojna była i poważna, ogorzała, ze skórą jakby spękaną, tak ją fałdy i marszczki pokryły całą siecią gęstą. Nad oczyma siwemi dwa krzaki bujnych brew sterczały najeżone. Suchą szyję, którą obnażoną widać było spod koszuli, jak twarz pokrajaną, brunatną, niby węże silne oplatały żyły pod skórą nabrzmiałe. W chwili, gdy podróżny starca zobaczył, ten właśnie na psy zawołał groźno, ręką im wskazując w tył, za siebie, a kij podnosząc do góry. Podróżni stanęli, rozglądając się ciekawie. Pokłon wam, stary Wiszu, rzekł z konia nie zsiadając podróżny, uchyliwszy tylko głowę. Pokłon wam. Każcie waszym psom do zagrody, boby nas porozdzierały, a my, starzy znajomi i dobrzy przyjaciele, choć nie swoi, a nie wrogi. Słowa te powoli wyrzekł starszy, łamaną mową Serbów nadłabiańskich, usiłując przybrać postawę i twarz uprzejmą. Stary patrzał, nic jeszcze nie odpowiadając. Na psy naprzód zakrzyczał dziko, aby poszły precz, ukazując im zagrodę, bo warczały i zęby szczerzyły, patrząc na przybyszów i coraz to się ku nim targały. Nie chciały odchodzić. Gospodarz huknął w dłoń. Na głos ten z zatynu ukazała się ostrzyżona głowa parobczaka, który, rozkaz zrozumiawszy, psy nawołał, wpędził do obejścia i zamknął za niemi wrota. Słychać je było szczekające i wyjące w szopie. Zdrów bywaj, Hengo. Cóżeście to znowu tak daleko w nasze lasy zawędrowali? Rzekł gospodarz. Rudy powoli z konia zlazłszy i dawszy go chłopcu, który na swoim pozostał, zbliżał się zwolna do starego. Ha, po świecie się tak człowiek włóczy, ciekaw zobaczyć, jak tam gdzie ludzie żyją. Począł mówić, przytem też jakaś zamiana zrobi się może. Lepiej w spokoju mieniać, czego u jednych zbytek, a drugim brak, niźli napadać zbrojno, a z życiem razem wydzierać. Ja, wy wiecie, człowiek spokojny, zaopatruję, komu czego trzeba, aby żyć. Stary się czegoś zadumiał. Nie bardzo u nas mieniać jest na co. Skór i futer dosyć pewnie u siebie macie, bursztynu u nas niewiele. Myśmy też niezwykli bardzo do rzeczy, które wozicie. Swojem się radzi obchodzić. Igła z ości tak szyje, jak żelazna. Popatrzał stary na ziemię i znowu się sobie zadumiał. Zda się to przecie, co ja wożę, mówił powoli Hengo. A skąd byście wzięli wszystko, co się z kruszcu robi, gdybyśmy wam tego nie dostawili? Do Winedy daleko. Albo to kości, rogu i kamienia niedosyć, rzekł stary Wisz, wzdychając. Był czas, że się ludzie tem obchodzili i dobrze im z tem było. Jakieście wy, a drudzy wędrowni podwozić zaczęli swoje błyskotki, niewiasty nam popsuliście. Chce im się ziarnek świecących na szyję i iglic gładkich, i guzów, i wszystkich tych zabawek, bez których teraz żadna nie stąpi. Nic by to nie było, ciągnął dalej, patrząc więcej w ziemię niż na przybyłego kupca, ale wy dróg się od nas uczycie, tajemnice nasze wywozicie stąd i tak samo przyjść może napaść, jak przyszły świecidełka. Hengo pokryjomu błyskiem oczów bystrych zmierzył starego Wisza i rozśmiał się. Różna to obawa, rzekł. Nikt o napaściach nie myśli. Ja nie jeżdżę cudzego podpatrywać, ale swoje mieniać. Wy mnie przecież znacie. Nie pierwszy raz jestem u starego Wisza. Ja przyjaciel wasz. Żonę miałem z waszej krwi, serbską córkę, a z niej oto tego chłopca, który choć języka waszego nie umie, przecie w nim trochę tamtej krwi zostało. Wisz, który na kamieniu siadł, a należący naprzeciw drugi wskazał Hędzę, pokiwał tylko głową. Żonę mieliście Serbkę z Natłaby, odezwał się, mówiliście mi o tem, ale jakeście do niej przyszli, he? Pewnie nie po jej woli. Rozśmiał się Hengo. Starzy jesteście, odparł, wam tego mówić nie trzeba. A gdzież to na świecie niewiast się o ich wolę pytają? Gdzie się inaczej żonę bierze jak ręką zbrojną? Tak jest u was, u nas i na całym świecie, bo one woli nie mają. Nie wszędzie, wtrącił stary. Młodym woli nie dają, a stare u nas szanują. Choć im rozumu odmawiają, przecie duchy przez nie mówią i wiedzą one więcej niż wy, te wiedźmy nasze. Potrząsnął głową, milczeli chwilę. Na noc was o gościnę proszę, odezwał się Hengo. Co mam z sobą w węzełkach, pokażę. Zechcecie to wziąć? Dobrze, a nie będzie zgody? Nie pogniewamy się o to. O gościnę prosić nie trzeba, zawołał Wisz wstając. Kto raz spał pod dachem naszym, zawsze ma pod nim spocząć prawo. My wam radzi. Kołacz i piwo i mięso się znajdzie. Baby strawę wieczorną już ważą. Chodźcie ze mną. Wisz wstał z kamienia i, przodem go wiodąc, ku wrotom się skierował.
Ubirajara, Lenda Tupi, de José de Alencar. Capítulo 1, Collection 9. Esta é uma gravação librivox. Todas as gravações librivox estão em domínio público. Para mais informações ou para ser um voluntário, visite librivox.org. Capítulo 1. Pela margem do grande rio caminha Jaguaré, o jovem caçador. O arco pende-lhe do ombro, esquecido e inútil. As flechas dormem no coldre da Uiraçaba. Os veados saltam das moitas de Ubaia e vêm retouçar na grama, zombando do caçador. Jaguaré não vê o tímido campeiro, seus olhos buscam um inimigo capaz de resistir-lhe ao braço robusto. O rugido do jaguar abala a floresta, mas o caçador também despreza o jaguar, que já cansou de vencer. Ele chama-se Jaguaré, o mais feroz jaguar da floresta. Os outros fogem espavoridos quando de longe o pressentem. Não é esse o inimigo que procura, porém outro mais terrível para vencê-lo em combate de morte e ganhar nome de guerra. Jaguaré chegou à idade em que o mancebo troca a fama de caçador pela glória do guerreiro. Para ser aclamado guerreiro por sua nação, é preciso que o jovem caçador conquiste este título por uma grande façanha. Por isso, deixou a taba dos seus e a presença de Jandira, a virgem formosa que lhe guarda o seio de esposa. Mas o sol 3 vezes guiou o passo rápido do caçador através das campinas, e 3 vezes, como agora, deitou-se além das montanhas de Aratuba, sem mostrar-lhe um inimigo digno de seu valor. A sombra vai descendo da serra pelo vale e a tristeza cai na fronte sobre a face de Jaguaré. O jovem caçador empunha a lança de 2 pontas, feita da roxa craúba, mais rija que o ferro. Nenhum guerreiro brandiu jamais esta arma terrível que sua mão primeiro fabricou. Lá estaca o jovem caçador no meio da campina, volvendo ao céu o olhar torvo e iracundo, solta ainda uma vez seu grito de guerra. O bramido rolou pela amplidão da mata e foi morrer longe nas cavernas da montanha. Respondeu o ronco da sucuri na madre do rio e o urro do tigre escondido na furna, mas outro grito de guerra não acudiu ao desafio do caçador. Jaguaré arremessou a lança que vibrou nos ares e foi cravar-se ao lendo no grosso tronco da emburana. A copa frondosa ramalhou como as plantas do coqueiro ao sopro do vento, e o tronco gemeu até a raiz. O caçador repousa à sombra de sua lança. Salta uma corça da mata e veloz atravessa a campina. Mais veloz a persegue gentil caçadora com a seta embebida no arco flexível. Ergue-se Jaguaré. Seu olhar ardente voou sôfrego de encontrar o inimigo que lhe tartava. Avistando uma mulher, a alegria do mancebo apagou-se no rosto sombrio. Pela faixa, cor de ouro, tecida de penas de tucano, Jaguaré conheceu que era uma filha da valente nação dos Tocantins, senhora do grande rio, cujas margens ele pisava. A liga vermelha que cingia a perna esbelta da estrangeira dizia que nenhum guerreiro jamais possuíra a Virgem Formosa. A corça veio cair aos pés de Jaguaré, atravessada pela flecha certeira da jovem caçadora que a seguia de perto. A Virgem reconheceu o cocar da nação que na última lua chegara aos campos do Taari e da qual os pajés tinham dado notícia. Guerreiro araguaia, pois vejo pela pena vermelha de seu cocar que pertences a esta nação valente. Se pisas os campos dos Tocantins como hóspede, bem-vindo sejas, mas se vens como inimigo, foge, para que tua mãe não chore a morte de seu filho e tenha quem a proteja na velhice. Virgem dos Tocantins, Jaguaré já soltou o seu grito de guerra. Ele pisa os campos de teus pais como senhor. Tu és sua prisioneira. Não que vencer a corça tímida seja glória para o caçador, mas tu chamarás o inimigo que ele espera. Se o veado te der a sua ligeireza, jovem guerreiro, ela não te servirá, senão para ver o rastro de meu pé antes que o vento o apague. A linda caçadora desferiu a corrida pela imensa campina. Após ela se arremessou o jaguaré, que muitas vezes vencera o tapir. Mas a Virgem dos Tocantins corria como anandu no deserto, e o caçador conheceu que seu braço nunca a poderia alcançar. Travou do arco e o brandiu. A seta obedeceu-lhe, pegando no tronco do açaí a faixa que flutuava ao sopro do vento. A filha dos Tocantins tem no pé as asas do beija-flor, mas a seta de jaguaré voa como o gavião. Não te assustem, virgem das florestas. Tua formosura venceu o ímpeto de meu braço e apagou a cólera no coração feroz do caçador. Feliz o guerreiro que te possuir. Eu sou Araci, a estrela do dia, filha de Itaquê, pai do grande nação Tocantins. 100 dos melhores guerreiros o servem em sua cabana para merecer que ele o escolha por filho. O mais forte e valente me terá por esposa. Vem comigo, guerreiro araguaia, excede aos outros no trabalho e na constância, e tu romperás a liga de Araci na próxima lua do amor. Não, filha do sol, Jaguaré não deixou a taba de seus pais, onde Jandira lhe guarda o seio de esposa, para ser escravo da Virgem. Ele vem combater e ganhar um nome de guerra que encha de orgulho sua nação. Torna à taba dos Tocantins e dize aos 100 guerreiros cativos de teu amor que Jaguaré, o mais destemido dos caçadores araguaias, os desafia ao combate. Araci vai, pois assim o queres. Se fores vencido, ela guardará tua lembrança, pois nunca seus olhos viram mais belo caçador. Se fores vencedor, será uma alegria para a Virgem do Sol pertencer ao mais valente dos guerreiros. A Virgem disse e desapareceu na selva. Os olhos de Jaguaré seguiram o passo ligeiro da formosa caçadora, como o guaxinim que rasteja a zabelê. Quando ela desapareceu, o jovem caçador recostou-se ao tronco de emburana e esperou. Do outro lado da campina assoma um guerreiro. Tem na cabeça o canitar das plumas de tucano e no punho do tacape uma franja das mesmas penas. É um guerreiro Tocantins. De longe avistou Jaguaré e reconheceu o penacho vermelho dos araguaias. As duas nações não estão em guerra, mas sem quebra de fé pode um guerreiro cansado do longo repouso oferecer a outro guerreiro combate leal. Quando Tocantins armou o arco, Jaguaré já tinha branido o seu e disparado no ar uma seta mensageira do desafio. Respondeu o guerreiro, disparando também uma flecha no ar para dizer que aceitava o combate. Então, os dois campeões caminharam um para o outro com o passo grave e pararam frente a frente. Eu sou Jaguaré, filho de Camacã, chefe da valente nação dos araguaias, que vem de longe em busca da terra de seus pais. Minha fama corre às tabas e tu já deves conhecer o maior caçador das florestas. Mas Jaguaré despreza a fama do caçador. Ele quer um nome de guerra, que diga às nações a força do seu braço e faça tremer aos mais bravos. Se tua nação te aclamou forte entre os fortes, prepara-te para morrer. Se não, passa teu caminho, guerreiro vil, para que o sangue do fraco não manche o tacape virgem de Jaguaré. O Caraíba guiou teu passo ao encontro de Pojucã, o matador de gente, guerreiro-chefe da terrível nação Tocantins, que enche de terror as outras nações. Há 3 luas, desde que fugiram espavoridos os bárbaros tapuias, que Pojucã não combate, e seu tacape tem fome do inimigo. Tu não és digno dos golpes de um guerreiro-chefe, mas Pojucã se compadece de tua mocidade e consente em combater contigo. Terás a glória de ser morto pelo mais valente guerreiro Tocantins. Os cantores de meus feitos lembrarão teu nome, e todos os mancebos de tua nação invejarão tua sorte. Jaguaré agradece a Tupã que te fez um grande guerreiro e o chefe mais feroz da grande nação Tocantins, Pojucã, matador de gente. A tua morte será a primeira façanha do caçador araguaia e lhe dará um nome de guerra que se torne o espanto dos teus e o terror das outras nações. Os 2 campeões recuaram passo a passo até se acharem a um tiro de arco. Eles soltaram o grito de guerra e se arremessaram um contra o outro, branindo o tacape. Os tacapes toparam no ar e os 2 guerreiros rodaram como as torrentes impetuosas no remoinho da Itaoca. 10 vezes as clavas bateram e 10 vezes volveram para bater de novo. Os animais que passavam na floresta fugiram espavoridos, como se a borrasca ribombasse no céu. Ainda uma vez encontraram-se os 2 tacapes e voaram em lascas pelos ares. O Ubiratã é forte, mas há outro Ubiratã que lhe resiste. Como o braço de Pojucã é que não há outro braço. Já viste, jovem caçador, o veado nas garras da jiboia? Assim vais morrer. Se tu fosses a cascavel que somente sabe morder, Jaguaré te esmagaria a cabeça com o pé e seguiria seu caminho. Mas tu és a jiboia feroz, e Jaguaré gosta de estrangular a jiboia. Não morrerás pelo pé, mas pela mão do caçador. Lança teu bote, guerreiro Tocantins. Pojucã estendeu os braços e estreitou os reinos de Jaguaré, que por sua vez cingiu os lombos do guerreiro. Cada um dos campeões pôs na luta todas as suas forças, bastantes para arrancar o tronco o mais robusto da mata. Ambos, porém, ficaram imóveis. Eram 2 jatobás que nasceram juntos e entrelaçaram os galhos, ligando-se ao mesmo tronco. Nada os desprende, nada os abala. O tufão passa branindo sem agitá-los, e eles permanecem quedos pelo volver dos tempos. Um pajé que passou na orla da mata viu os lutadores e esconjurou-os, pensando que eram as almas de 2 guerreiros presos no abraço da morte. Já a sombra se desdobrava pelo vale fora e o sol despedia-se dos cimos dos montes sem que os campeões se movessem. Por fim, afrouxaram os braços e cada lutador recuou para contemplar seu adversário. Nenhum mostrava no rosto sombra de fadiga. Conheceram que podiam lutar corpo a corpo a noite inteira, sem que um prostrasse o outro. Tu és igual na valentia e na força ao guerreiro-chefe da nação Tocantins. Mas Pojucã não consente que haja na terra quem resista a seu braço. É preciso que tu morras, Jaguaré, para que ele seja o primeiro dos guerreiros que o sol alumia. Pojucã, matador de gente, guerreiro feroz da nação Tocantins, Jaguaré deixou-te viver até este momento para saber se tu eras digno de dar-lhe um nome de guerra. Agora que te conhece como o primeiro dos guerreiros que existiram até este momento, ele quer que tua derrota seja a sua primeira façanha. Disse, e arrancando do tronco da emburana a lança de 2 pontas, caminhou outra vez para Pojucã. Esta arma que tu vês é a lança de 2 pontas. Jaguaré fabricou-a do rijo galho da craúba, endurecida pelo fogo. Sua mão foi a primeira que o arremessou, e teu corpo é o primeiro cujo sangue ela vai beber. Empunha a lança de 2 pontas, guerreiro-chefe, e ataca Jaguaré para receberes a morte dos valentes. Pojucã repeliu a lança que o jovem caçador lhe apresentara. Jamais no combate um guerreiro Tocantins atacará seu adversário desarmado. Nem Pojucã precisa da lança. Ataca tu, Jaguaré, que não tens confiança em teu braço. O de Pojucã basta para te prostrar. O orgulho te cega, guerreiro-chefe. A lança conhece Jaguaré, que a inventou, e lhe obedece como o arpão à corda do pescador. Aperta bem em tua mão robusta, e Jaguaré estará 2 vezes mais armado do que tu, que não sabes manejá-la. O chefe Tocantins cruzou os braços. Toma a lança, Pojucã, se não queres que te chame covarde, pois tu sabes que Jaguaré não te matará desarmado, mas te abandonará como indigno de combater com o filho do maior guerreiro Araguaia, o grande Camacan. O chefe Tocantins arrojou-se contra Jaguaré, que travou-lhe os pulsos, e outra vez os 2 campeões ficaram imóveis. A noite veio achá-los na mesma posição. 3 vezes cessaram a luta, e de novo a travaram. Mas afinal se convenceram que nenhum derrubaria o outro. Então Pojucã disse: Guerreiro Araguaia, é preciso acabar o combate. A terra não chega para dois guerreiros como nós. Finca no chão a lança e caminhemos até a margem do rio. Aquele que primeiro chegar será o senhor da lança e da vida do outro. Assim fizeram os dois campeões. Chegados à margem do rio, dispararam a corrida. Ao mesmo tempo, a mão de ambos tocou a haste da lança, mas Jaguaré, arremessado pelo ímpeto da desfilada, não pôde arrancar a arma que ficou na mão de Pojucã. O guerreiro-chefe enrista desdenhosamente a lança e caminha para Jaguaré. Não vai como o guerreiro que marcha ao combate, mas como o matador que se prepara para imolar a vítima. Guerreiro-chefe, Jaguaré não te quer matar como a serpente que ataca o descuidado caçador. 10 vezes já se quisesse ele, te houvera ferido com tua própria mão. Abandona a glória de guerreiro, que não é para ti, Nhengarriba. Pojucã te concederá a vida e te levará cativo à taba dos Tocantins, para que tu cantes as suas façanhas nas festas dos guerreiros. Cativo serás tu, mas não para cantar os feitos dos guerreiros. Tu servirás na taba dos araguaias para ajudar as velhas a varrer a oca. Arremessou-se Pojucã avante e desfechou o golpe, mas a lança rodara e foi o chefe Tocantim que recebeu no peito a ponta farpada. Quando o corpo robusto de Pojucã tombava, cravado pelo dardo, Jaguaré de um salto colocou a mão direita sobre o ombro esquerdo do vencido e, branindo a arma sangrenta, soltou o grito do triunfo. Eu sou o Birajara, o senhor da lança, o guerreiro invencível que tem por arma a serpente. Reconhece o teu vencedor, Pojucã, e proclama o primeiro dos guerreiros, pois te venceu a ti o maior guerreiro que existiu antes dele. Se meu valor que serviu para aumentar a tua fama merece de ti uma graça, não deixes que Pojucã sofra mais um instante a vergonha de sua derrota. Não, chefe Tocantim, tu me acompanharás à taba dos araguaias para narrar meu valor. A fama de Jaguaré precisa de um prisioneiro como o grande Pojucã na festa da vitória. Tu és cruel, guerreiro da lança, mas fica certo que se tua arma traiçoeira feriu meu peito, o suplício não vencerá a constância do varão Tocantim, que sabe afrontar as iras de Tupã e desprezar a vingança dos araguaias. Fim do capítulo 1.
Up from Slavery, an Autobiography by Booker T. Washington. First chapter, Collection 9. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Jacqueline Burrell Walton. Up from Slavery, an Autobiography. A Slave Among Slaves. I was born a slave on a plantation in Franklin County, Virginia. I am not quite sure of the exact place or exact date of my birth, but at any rate, I suspect I must have been born somewhere and at some time. As nearly as I have been able to learn, I was born near a crossroads post office called Hales Ford, and the year was 1858 or 1859. I do not know the month or the day. The earliest impressions I can now recall are of the plantation and the slave quarters, the latter being the part of the plantation where the slaves had their cabins. My life had its beginnings in the midst of the most miserable, desolate, and discouraging surroundings. This was so, however, not because my owners were especially cruel, for they were not, as compared with many others. I was born in a typical log cabin about 14 by 16 feet square. In this cabin, I lived with my mother and a brother and sister till after the Civil War, when we were all declared free. Of my ancestry, I know almost nothing. In the slave quarters and even later, I heard whispered conversations among the colored people of the tortures which the slaves, including, no doubt, my ancestors on my mother's side, suffered in the middle passage of the slave ship while being conveyed from Africa to America. I have been unsuccessful in securing any information that would throw any accurate light upon the history of my family beyond my mother. She, I remember, had a half-brother and a half-sister. In the days of slavery, not very much attention was given to family history and family records, that is, black family records. My mother, I suppose, attracted the attention of a purchaser who was afterward my owner and hers. Her addition to the slave family attracted about as much attention as the purchase of a new horse or cow. Of my father, I know even less than of my mother. I do not even know his name. I have heard reports to the effect that he was a white man who lived on one of the nearby plantations. Whoever he was, I never heard of his taking the least interest in me or providing in any way for my rearing. But I do not find a special fault with him. He was simply another unfortunate victim of the institution which the nation unhappily had engrafted upon it at that time. The cabin was not only our living place, but was also used as the kitchen for the plantation. My mother was the plantation cook. The cabin was without glass windows. It had only openings in the side which let in the light and also the cold, chilly air of winter. There was a door to the cabin, that is, something that was called a door, but the uncertain hinges by which it was hung and the large cracks in it, to say nothing of the fact that it was too small, made the room a very uncomfortable one. In addition to these openings, there was in the lower right-hand corner of the room the cat hole, a contrivance which almost every mansion or cabin in Virginia possessed during the antebellum period. The cat hole was a square opening, about 7 by 8 inches, provided for the purpose of letting the cat pass in and out of the house at will during the night. In the case of our particular cabin, I could never understand the necessity for this convenience, since there were at least a half-dozen other places in the cabin that would have accommodated the cats. There was no wooden floor in our cabin, the naked earth being used as a floor. In the center of the earthen floor there was a large, deep opening covered with boards, which was used as a place in which to store sweet potatoes during the winter. An impression of this potato hole is very distinctly engraved upon my memory, because I recall that during the process of putting the potatoes in or taking them out, I would often come into possession of one or two, which I roasted and thoroughly enjoyed. There was no cooking stove on our plantation, and all the cooking for the whites and slaves my mother had to do over an open fireplace, mostly in pots and skillets. While the poorly built cabin caused us to suffer with cold in the winter, the heat from the open fireplace in summer was equally trying. The early years of my life, which were spent in the little cabin, were not very different from those of thousands of other slaves. My mother, of course, had little time in which to give attention to the training of her children during the day. She snatched a few moments for our care in the early morning before her work began, and at night after the day's work was done. One of my earliest recollections is that of my mother cooking a chicken late at night and awaking her children for the purpose of feeding them. How or where she got it, I do not know. I presume, however, it was procured from our owner's farm. Some people may call this theft. If such a thing were to happen now, I should condemn it as theft myself. But taking place at the time it did, and for the reason that it did, no one could ever make me believe that my mother was guilty of thieving. She was simply a victim of the system of slavery. I cannot remember having slept in a bed until after our family was declared free by the Emancipation Proclamation. 3 children, John, my older brother, Amanda, my sister, and myself, had a pallet on the dirt floor, or to be more correct, we slept in and on a bundle of filthy rags laid upon the dirt floor. I was asked not long ago to tell something about the sports and pastimes that I engaged in during my youth. Until that question was asked, it had never occurred to me that there was no period of my life that was devoted to play. From the time that I can remember anything, almost every day of my life had been occupied in some kind of labor, though I think I would now be more useful man if I had had time for sports. During the period that I spent in slavery, I was not large enough to be of much service. Still, I was occupied most of the time in cleaning the yards, carrying water to the men in the fields, or going to the mill to which I used to take the corn once a week to be ground. The mill was about 3 miles from the plantation. This work I always dreaded. The heavy bag of corn would be thrown across the back of the horse, and the corn divided about evenly on each side. But in some way, almost without exception on these trips, the corn would so shift as to become unbalanced, and would fall off the horse, and often I would fall with it. As I was not strong enough to reload the corn upon the horse, I would have to wait, sometimes for many hours, till a chance passerby came along who would help me out of my trouble. The hours while waiting for someone were usually spent in crying. Time consumed in this way made me late in reaching the mill, and by the time I got my corn ground and reached home, it would be far into the night. The road was a lonely one, and often led through dense forests. I was always frightened. The woods were said to be full of soldiers who had deserted from the army, and I had been told that the first thing a deserter did to a Negro boy when he found him alone was to cut off his ears. Besides, when I was late in getting home, I knew I would always get a severe scolding or a flogging. I had no schooling whatever while I was a slave, though I remember on several occasions I went as far as the schoolhouse door with one of my young mistresses to carry her books. The picture of several dozen boys and girls in a schoolroom engaged in study made a deep impression upon me, and I had the feeling that to get into a schoolhouse and study in this way would be about the same as getting into paradise. So far as I can recall, the first knowledge that I got out of the fact that we were slaves and that freedom of the slaves was being discussed was early one morning before day, when I was awakened by my mother kneeling over her children and fervently praying that Lincoln and his armies might be successful, and that one day she and her children might be free. In this connection, I have never been able to understand how the slaves throughout the South, completely ignorant as were the masses so far as books or newspapers were concerned, were able to keep themselves so accurately and completely informed about the great national questions that were agitating the country. From the time that Garrison, Lovejoy, and others began to agitate for freedom, the slaves throughout the South kept in close touch with the progress of the movement. Though I was a mere child during the preparation for the Civil War and during the war itself, I now recall the many late-at-night whisper discussions that I heard my mother and the other slaves on the plantation indulge in. These discussions showed that they understood the situation and that they kept themselves informed of events by what was termed the grapevine telegraph. During the campaign, when Lincoln was first a candidate for the presidency, the slaves on our far-off plantation, miles from any railroad or large city or daily newspaper, knew what the issues involved were. When war was begun between the North and the South, every slave on our plantation felt and knew that, though other issues were discussed, the primal one was that of slavery. Even the most ignorant members of my race on the remote plantations felt in their hearts, with a certainty that admitted of no doubt, that the freedom of the slaves would be the one great result of the war if the Northern armies conquered. Every success of the Federal armies and every defeat of the Confederate forces was watched with the keenest and most intense interest. Often the slaves got knowledge of the results of great battles before the white people received it. This news was usually gotten from the colored man who was sent to the post office for the mail. In our case, the post office was about 3 miles from the plantation, and the mail came once or twice a week. The man who was sent to the office would linger about the place long enough to get the drift of the conversation from the group of white people who naturally congregated there after receiving their mail to discuss the latest news. The mail carrier, on his way back to our master's house, would as naturally retell the news as he had secured among the slaves, and in this way they often heard of important events before the white people at the big house, as the master's house was called. I cannot remember a single instance during my childhood or early boyhood when our entire family sat down to the table together and God's blessing was asked, and the family ate a meal in a civilized manner. On the plantation in Virginia and even later, meals were gotten by the children very much as dumb animals get theirs. It was a piece of bread here and a scrap of meat there. It was a cup of milk at one time and some potatoes at another. Sometimes a portion of our family would eat out of the skillet or pot, while someone else would eat from the tin plate held on the knees, and often using nothing but the hands with which to hold the food. When I had grown to sufficient size, I was required to go to the big house at mealtimes to fan the flies from the table by means of a large set of paper fans operated by a pulley. Naturally, much of the conversation of the white people turned upon the subject of freedom and the war, and I absorbed a good deal of it. I remember that at one time I saw 2 of my young mistresses and some lady visitors eating ginger cakes in the yard. At that time, those cakes seemed to me to be absolutely the most tempting and desirable things I had ever seen. And I then and there resolved that, if I ever got free, the height of my ambition would be reached if I could get to the point where I could secure and eat ginger cakes in the way that I saw those ladies doing. Of course, as the war was prolonged, the white people in many cases often found it difficult to secure food for themselves. I think the slaves felt the deprivation less than the whites, because the usual diet for slaves was cornbread and pork, and these could be raised on the plantation. But coffee, tea, sugar, and other articles which the whites had been accustomed to use could not be raised on the plantation, and the conditions brought about by the war frequently made it impossible to secure these things. The whites were often in great straits. Parched corn was used for coffee, and a kind of black molasses was used instead of sugar. Many times nothing was used to sweeten the so-called tea and coffee. The first pair of shoes that I recall wearing were wooden ones. They had rough leather on the top, but the bottoms, which were about an inch thick, were of wood. When I walked, they made a fearful noise, and besides this, they were very inconvenient, since there was no yielding to the natural pressure of the foot. And wearing them, one presented an exceedingly awkward appearance. The most trying ordeal that I was forced to endure as a slave boy, however, was the wearing of a flax shirt. In the portion of Virginia where I lived, it was common to use flax as part of the clothing for the slaves. That part of the flax from which our clothing was made was largely the refuse, which of course was the cheapest and roughest part. I can scarcely imagine any torture except perhaps the pulling of a tooth that is equal to that caused by putting on a new flax shirt for the first time. It is almost equal to the feeling that one would experience if he had a dozen or more chestnut burrs or 100 small pinpoints in contact with his flesh. Even to this day, I can recall accurately the tortures that I underwent when putting on one of these garments. The fact that my flesh was soft and tender added to the pain. But I had no choice. I had to wear the flax shirt or none. And had it been left to me to choose, I should have chosen to wear no covering. In connection with the flax shirt, my brother John, who is several years older than I am, performed one of the most generous acts that I ever heard of one slave relative doing for another. On several occasions when I was being forced to wear a new flax shirt, he generously agreed to put it on in my stead and wear it for several days till it was broken in. Until I was grown to be quite a youth, this single garment was all that I wore. One may get the idea from what I have said that there was bitter feeling toward the white people on the part of my race because of the fact that most of the white population was away fighting in a war which would result in keeping the Negro in slavery if the South was successful. In the case of the slaves on our place, this was not true. And it was not true of any large portion of the slave population in the South, where the Negro was treated with anything like decency. During the Civil War, one of my young masters was killed, and 2 were severely wounded. I recall the feeling of sorrow which existed among the slaves when they heard of the death of Mars Billy. It was no sham sorrow, but real. Some of the slaves had nursed Mars Billy. Others had played with him when he was a child. Mars Billy had begged for mercy in the case of others when the overseer or master was thrashing them. The sorrow in the slave quarter was only second to that in the big house. When the 2 young masters were brought home wounded, the sympathy of the slaves was shown in many ways. They were just as anxious to assist in the nursing as the family relatives of the wounded. Some of the slaves would even beg for the privilege of sitting up at night to nurse their wounded masters. Their tenderness and sympathy on part of those held in bondage was a result of their kindly and generous nature. In order to defend and protect the women and children who were left on the plantation when the white males went to war, the slaves would have laid down their lives. The slave who was selected to sleep in the big house during the absence of the males was considered to have the place of honor. Anyone attempted to harm young mistress or old mistress during the night would have had to cross the dead body of the slave to do so. I do not know how many have noticed it, but I think that it will be found to be true that there are few instances, either in slavery or freedom, in which a member of my race has been known to betray a specific trust. As a rule, not only did the members of my race entertain no feelings of bitterness against the whites before and during the war, but there are many instances of Negroes tenderly caring for their former masters and mistresses, who for some reason have become poor and dependent since the war. I know of instances where the former masters of slaves have for years been supplied with money by their former slaves to keep them from suffering. I have known of still other cases in which the former slaves have assisted in the education of the descendants of their former owners. I know of a case on a large plantation in the South in which a young white man, the son of the former owner of the estate, has become so reduced in purse and self-control by reason of drink that he is a pitiable creature. And yet, notwithstanding the poverty of the colored people themselves on this plantation, they have for years supplied this young white man with the necessities of life. One sends him a little coffee or sugar, another a little meat, and so on. Nothing that the colored people possess is too good for the son of an old Morris Tom, who will perhaps never be permitted to suffer while any remain on the place who knew directly or indirectly of old Morris Tom. I have said that there are few instances of a member of my race betraying a specific trust. One of the best illustrations of this which I know of is in the case of an ex-slave from Virginia, whom I met not long ago in a little town in the state of Ohio. I found that this man had made a contract with his master 2 or 3 years previous to the Emancipation Proclamation, to the effect that the slave was to be permitted to buy himself by paying so much per year for his body. And while he was paying for himself, he was to be permitted to labor where and for whom he pleased. Finding that he could secure better wages in Ohio, he went there. When freedom came, he was still in debt to his master, some $300. Notwithstanding that the Emancipation Proclamation freed him from any obligation to his master, this black man walked the greater portion of the distance back to where his old master lived in Virginia and placed the last dollar with interest in his hands. In talking to me about this, the man told me that he knew that he did not have to pay the debt, but that he has given his word to the master, and his word he had never broken. He felt that he could not enjoy his freedom till he had fulfilled his promise. From some things that I have said, one may get the idea that some of the slaves did not want freedom. This is not true. I have never seen one who did not want to be free, or one who would return to slavery. I pity from the bottom of my heart any nation or body of people that is so unfortunate as to get entangled in the net of slavery. I have long since ceased to cherish any spirit of bitterness against the Southern white people on account of the enslavement of my race. No one section of our country was wholly responsible for its introduction, and besides, it was recognized and protected for years by the general government. Having once got its tentacles fastened on to the economic and social life of the Republic, it was no easy matter for the country to relieve itself of the institution. Then, when we rid ourselves of prejudice or racial feeling and look facts in the face, we must acknowledge that, notwithstanding the cruelty and moral wrong of slavery, the 10 million Negroes inhabiting this country, who themselves or whose ancestors went through the school of American slavery, are in a stronger and more hopeful condition, materially, intellectually, morally, and religiously, than is true of an equal number of black people in any other portion of the globe. This is so to such an extent that Negroes in this country, who themselves or whose forefathers went through the school of slavery, are constantly returning to Africa as missionaries to enlighten those who remained in the fatherland. This I say not to justify slavery. On the other hand, I condemn it as an institution, as we all know that in America it was established for selfish and financial reasons, and not from a missionary motive, but to call attention to the fact and to show how Providence so often uses men and institutions to accomplish a purpose. When persons ask me in these days how, in the midst of what sometimes seem hopelessly discouraging conditions, I can have such faith in the future of my race in this country, I remind them of the wilderness through which and out of which a good providence has already led us. Ever since I have been old enough to think for myself, I have entertained the idea that, notwithstanding the cruel wrongs inflicted upon us, the black man got nearly as much out of slavery as the white man did. The hurtful influences of the institutions were not by any means confined to the Negro. This was fully illustrated by the life upon our own plantation. The whole machinery of slavery was so constructed as to cause labor, as a rule, to be looked upon as a badge of degradation, of inferiority. Hence, labor was something that both races on the slave plantation sought to escape. The slave system on our place, in a large measure, took the spirit of self-reliance and self-help out of the white people. My old master had many boys and girls, but not one, so far as I know, ever mastered a single trade or special line of productive industry. The girls were not taught to cook, sew, or to take care of the house. All of this was left to the slaves. The slaves, of course, had little personal interest in the life of the plantation, and their ignorance prevented them from learning how to do things in the most improved and thorough manner. As a result of the system, fences were out of repair, gates were hanging half off the hinges, doors creaked, window panes were out, plastering had fallen but was not replaced, weeds grew in the yard. As a rule, there was food for whites and blacks, but inside the house and on the dining room table, there was wanting that delicacy and refinement of touch and finish which can make a home the most convenient, comfortable, and attractive place in the world. Withal, there was a waste of food and other materials which was sad. When freedom came, the slaves were almost as well fitted to begin life anew as the master, except in the matter of book learning and ownership of property. The slave owner and his sons had mastered no special industry. They unconsciously had imbibed the feeling that manual labor was not the proper thing for them. On the other hand, the slaves in many cases had mastered some handicraft, and none were ashamed, and few unwilling to labor. Finally, the war closed, and the day of freedom came. It was a momentous and eventful day to all upon our plantation. We had been expecting it. Freedom was in the air, and had been for months. Deserting soldiers returning to their homes were to be seen every day. Others who had been discharged or whose regiments had been paroled were constantly passing near our place. The grapevine telegraph was kept busy night and day. The news and mutterings of great events were swiftly carried from one plantation to another. In the fear of Yankee invasions, the silverware and other valuables were taken from the big house, buried in the woods, and guarded by trusted slaves. Woe be to anyone who would have attempted to disturb the buried treasure. The slaves would give the Yankee soldiers food, drink, clothing, anything but that which had been specifically entrusted to their care and honor. As the great day drew nearer, there was more singing in the slave quarters than usual. It was bolder, had more ring, and lasted later into the night. Most of the verses of the plantation songs had some reference to freedom. True, they had sung these same verses before, but they had been careful to explain that the freedom in these songs referred to the next world and had no connection with life in this world. Now they gradually threw off the mask and were not afraid to let it be known that the freedom in their songs meant freedom of the body in this world. The night before the eventful day, word was sent to the slave quarters to the effect that something unusual was going to take place at the big house the next morning. There was little, if any, sleep that night, all as excitement and expectancy. Early the next morning, word was sent to all the slaves, old and young, to gather at the house. In company with my mother, brother, and sister, and a large number of other slaves, I went to the master's house. All of our master's family were either standing or seated on the veranda of the house, where they could see what was to take place and hear what was said. There was a feeling of deep interest or perhaps sadness on their faces, but not bitterness. As I now recall the impression they made upon me, they did not at the moment seem to be sad because of the loss of property, but rather because of parting with those whom they had reared and who were in many ways very close to them. The most distinct thing that I now recall in connection with the scene was that some man who seemed to be a stranger, United States officer, I presume, made a little speech and then read a rather long paper, the Emancipation Proclamation, I think. After the reading, we were told that we were all free and could go when and where we pleased. My mother, who was standing by my side, leaned over and kissed her children, while tears of joy ran down her cheeks. She explained to us what it all meant, that this was the day for which she had been so long praying, but fearing that she would never live to see. For some minutes there was great rejoicing and thanksgiving and wild scenes of ecstasy, but there was no feeling of bitterness. In fact, there was pity among the slaves for our former owners. The wild rejoicing on the part of the emancipated colored people lasted but for a brief period, for I noticed that by the time they returned to their cabins, there was a change in their feelings. The great responsibility of being free, of having charge of themselves, of having to think and plan for themselves and their children, seemed to take possession of them. It was very much like suddenly turning a youth of 10 or 12 years out into the world to provide for himself. In a few hours, the great questions with which the Anglo-Saxon race had been grappling for centuries had been thrown upon these people to be solved. These were the questions of a home, a living, the rearing of children, education, citizenship, and the establishment and support of churches. Was it any wonder that within a few hours the wild rejoicing ceased and a feeling of deep gloom seemed to pervade the slave quarters? To some, it seemed that now that they were in actual possession of it, freedom was a more serious thing than they had expected to find it. Some of the slaves were 70 or 80 years old. Their best days were gone. They had no strength with which to earn a living in a strange place and among strange people, even if they had been sure where to find a new place of abode. To this class, the problem seemed especially hard. Besides, deep down in their hearts, there was a strange and peculiar attachment to old Master and old Mrs., and to their children, which they found it hard to think of breaking off. With these, they had spent in some cases nearly a half-century, and it was no light thing to think of parting. Gradually, one by one, stealthily at first, the older slaves began to wander from the slave quarters back to the big house to have a whispered conversation with their former owners as to the future. End of Chapter 1 of Up from Slavery, an Autobiography. Recording by Jacqueline Burrell Walton.
The Voice in the Rice by Governor Morris.
First Chapter Collection 9.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. The Voice in the Rice. 2 bunglers. The night came on monstrously rough and windy, but clear. I remember how, when the SS Major Pickens rolled, the stars flew past my port like streams of sparks from the smokestack of a locomotive. You weren't safe in your berth or out of it. We had on board a number of horses, with their grooms, bound for New York from various winter resorts in the south, and during a particularly violent lurch of the vessel, one of these poor beasts fell and splintered its leg, and could be heard screaming with the pain like a lost soul until mercifully put to death. The passengers were mostly servants of northern families, and whether they were more sick than frightened or more frightened than sick was a question for a more experienced seafarer than myself. We made slow work of it. The antiquated engine was loose in the pins. The coal supply at Charleston for the run to New York clinkered into obdurate masses, impermeable to flame, and the wind and seas came against us like all possessed. If the captain could have seen his way to it, he would have turned and run back to port, but he did not believe that his command could weather a turn. Her best chance was to buck the seas. About midnight the weather thickened over one star after another till all were gone. I went on deck. Here was a pretty clean sweep. 2 of our port boats were gone, and I noticed, with a wicked clutch at the hand line along the deck house, that there was no longer a port rail between me and the ocean. But I was determined on one point, that I would not soon again return to my coffin of a berth, with its stale smells, its impossible sudden dives and plunges, and its loathsome suggestions of cockroaches and worse. Clinging with all my might and caution to the hand line, and averting my eyes from the dizzying gap in the rail, I moved cautiously forward in the lee of the deck house. When the Major Pickens rolled to starboard, I lay, as it were, upon the side of the deck house, as upon a slant of roof, but when she elevated down to leeward, I could hardly keep a semblance of footing, and was left, to all intents and purposes, hanging by my hands alone. Now and then I could hear, following a thundering concussion forward, the sound of solid water mill racing aft along the starboard deck, or, from deep within the bowels of the ship, the retching groan of overstrained iron. Presently I was aware of a man progressing slowly toward me, his face to the deck house and his hands carefully overhauling the line. When we came close together, I was still wondering how we were to pass each other safely, and the same thought must have been in his head, for, having met, we paused side by side for some moments before attempting the maneuver. Presently he turned his face toward me. It was wet with sea water, a shrewd, lively face with a grey moustache and goatee. "We're right off the Santee," he said, or shouted, for there was an infernal din going on. "That's why it's so rough. It will be smoother directly. I have been in the pilot house talking with the captain. Now I am going down to see after my horse. A lovely mare, sir." "Will you pass outside or inside?" I shouted. "Whichever you say." "As the older man," he said, his eyes twinkling, "I had better be the pivot, sir. Let us wait until our side of the vessel is about to be uppermost. Now, sir, as we are rising. I loosed my left hand and passed it around his back, and once more gripped the line. "So," said he, "keep her so until the next roll." I waited then until the deck began once more to press against the soles of my feet, let go my right hand, and heaven alone knows exactly what happened. I have thought, however, that as the ship was staggering up from the long roll to leeward, she was suddenly beaten down and back, as a fighter, rising from a knockdown blow, gets to his knees and is once more felled by an adversary who has momentarily passed beyond the restraints of the rules. But I know that while my right hand was holding to nothing, the stranger's weight came suddenly full force against my chest, and tore loose the grip that I had on the line with my left hand, that he turned and clutched me, and that, locked like a pair of dancers, we slipped and revolved in a kind of lugubrious waltzing, upright, without cry or comment, down the slant of slippery deck, through the long gash in the port rail, and into the sea. The heavy impact separated us, and I have never seen that cheery, twinkling face from that day to this, nor known who he was, nor who mourned for him. End of chapter 1. Of the Voice in the Rise.